When we adjourned yesterday, we had called up H.R. 2273. We're going to lay that aside for the time being and instead bring up H.R. 2401 first. So the clerk will report the title.
H.R. 2401 to require analysis of the cumulative and incremental impacts of certain rules and actions of the Environmental Protection Agency and for other purposes.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, so ordered. First, are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Bilbray.
I think I've got an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk, so this is a bipartisan amendment?
Yes, it is.
And the clerk will report the title of the amendment.
What's the number, sir?
Excuse me?
Clerk will report the amendment.
The number of the amendment.
It's the Bass, Matheson, Green, Bilbray. What's the number? We have a number on it? I'd have the number if I had a number of amendments, but seeing that we had one, I figured this was...
An amendment to H.R. 2401 offered by Mr. Bilbray.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment, and the staff will distribute the amendment. Thank
you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle of addressing this. Mr. Chairman, this is a balance between the fiscal responsibility of basically making the tough decisions to cut when a cut needs to be made, but it also has the environmental sensitivity to understand that diesel emissions is a very toxic emission that we need to address, something that became very obvious for myself when I was serving on the Air Resources Board in California, that it is an item that was ignored for too long. But this amendment, all it basically says is that we will pay for the bill for that expense, but the funding will continue on the off years to address this environmental concern, and that's the toxic diesel emissions. It's one of those issues that we're cooperating with state and local agencies to address it, and I think the fact that we do have the bipartisan support and the names that are on there, I'm very, very proud to have this amendment before us and showing that this committee can address bipartisan issues that address the fiscal responsibility and the environmental concerns at the same time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are the other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Mr. Green is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I want to thank my colleague from California for working with us on this amendment. The Diesel Emissions Reduction Act establishes a voluntary national and state-level grant and loan program to reduce emissions from existing diesel engines through clean diesel retrofits. The program has proved popular and successful, and every state in the nation now has a diesel retrofit program and benefits from DARA funding. For example, on March 28th of 2011, approximately 500 groups across the country, ranging from the American Lung Association to the American Manufacturers Association, wrote to the House Appropriations Committee requesting support for the program. The EPA has established that if DARA was fully funded, it would reduce particulate matter emissions by 70,000 tons, generate nearly $20 billion in economic benefit, and return $13 for every benefit for every $1 invested. That's why I'm a co-sponsor of the amendment, which would amend the bill to ensure that DARA is authorized at the $100 million level through 2016. Again, I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan amendment, and again, appreciate the working across the aisle to help drafting in this amendment. I yield back my time.
Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote then comes on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California and the gentleman from Texas. Those in support of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. There are other amendments. Other members wishing to offer an amendment, particularly a bipartisan amendment?
Mr.
Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
I have an amendment at the desk. It's RO1.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2401 offered by Mr. Whitfield.
Ask unanimous consent that we dispense with the
Amendment will
reading.
be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized in support of his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an amendment offered by Mr. Ross and myself, and yesterday President Obama issued another executive order expressing concern about the unemployment rate going up to 9.2%. And in this executive order issued Monday, he's ordering that all independent regulatory agencies, including EPA, do significant reanalysis of recent regulations that they've issued and the impact that this will have on the economy as well as other aspects of our society. This amendment, I think President Obama would be supportive of our amendment because under the TRAIN Act, we're asking, because EPA is acting with such aggressive issuance of regulations now. They've recently done a greenhouse gas permitting rule, a boiler MAC rule, utility MAC. They're coming out with new ozone ambient air quality standards early. They've got the cross-state air pollution rule that just came out, coal ash rule, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, greenhouse gas new source performance standards, regional haze rules. They're moving at an unprecedented rate. And the TRAIN Act basically sets up a committee to study the global economic impact on the competitiveness of the United States as a result of the cumulative impact of all these regulations. It also looks at the cumulative cost, and some people have been saying we're not looking at cumulative benefits under the TRAIN Act, but if you look at the language on page 3, it says look at cumulative cost and cumulative benefits, including evaluation. Also, we look at the change in national, state, and regional electricity prices. We look at the change in national, state, and regional fuel prices. We look at the impact on national, state, and regional unemployment and employment figures. We look at the reliability, the impact on the reliability of our electricity grid and the adequacy of bulk power supply. Now, and we also look at the assumptions of EPA in their modeling. And this is important for this reason. All of these regulations, particularly on air transport rules, utility MAC, relates to the Northeast under the air transport rules particularly. And we hear a lot about the impact that's having on health for people in the Northeast, which we're all concerned about. But these assumptions, for example, do not take into consideration the impact on the health of young people in Appalachia, in Kentucky, West Virginia, and other parts of the country where a lot of coal is used, because these regulations will put coal utilities and coal miners out of business. And what impact does that have on the health of their children? That is not something that the EPA modeling looks at. So the TRAIN Act asks and requires that they look at their assumptions and make some considerations about this. I might also say that on the utility MAC, a coalition of unions concluded that based upon EPA data, not a single coal plant in EPA's sample of 200 units, including units with state-of-the-art control equipment, could meet the utility MAC's combined emission limits. So not one could meet it. So this amendment that we offer today, Mr. Ross and I, simply says that utility MAC, which is not a final rule yet, cannot be finalized or implemented until 6 months after the study required by the TRAIN Act has been completed, which would be sometime in late July, early August of 2012. It also says that the air transport rule, which has been finalized and is expected to go into effect in January of 2012, just a few months away, that cannot be implemented until 6 months after this additional study has been made. I think we would be irresponsible to not postpone the effective date of these regulations from EPA until after this comprehensive study has been completed on the cumulative impact of cost and benefits. And I would urge every member to support this amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Ross, the co-sponsor of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Congressman Whitfield for his work on this amendment. I also want to thank Congressman Sullivan and Matheson for your work on the underlying legislation, the Transparency and Regulatory Analysis of Impacts on the Nation Act, or TRAIN Act, which will provide time for the appropriate agencies to conduct an analysis of the cumulative impacts of the regulations currently being developed by the EPA. This amendment provides a limited time period after the final report has been issued to allow regulators to assess the impacts of the Utility MACT rule and the Cross-State Air Pollution rule on jobs and economic growth. Specifically, it would prohibit the administration from taking final action on these rules until at least 6 months after the final report is issued on the cumulative economic impacts required under the TRAIN Act, which is August 1 of 2012. I believe this time is critical to examine the cost and benefits of these rules, along with any potential for job loss and the feasibility of the timelines associated with the implementation of these rules. The EPA estimates that the cost of the Utility MACT rule alone would be $10.9 billion annually in 2016, and an electricity price increase for working families, small businesses, and seniors, and everyone else of 3.7% in 2015. We absolutely must understand the impacts of these rules before they are implemented, and this amendment is a logical step to ensure that we are fully informed of the potential costs and benefits of these regulations as we move forward. Basically, as Congressman Whitfield stated, this is just a 6-month delay on not all the rules, but 2 of the rules, those being the Utility MACT rule and what's commonly referred to as the transport rule. And Mr. Chairman, let me just point out a couple of things, if I may, as it relates to, for example, the Utility MACT rule. Utilities are expected to be required to comply with the MACT provisions by 2015. EPA expects utilities to comply through the installation of scrubbers, selective catalytic reduction, various injections, fabric filter, baghouse technologies, and here's the real kicker on that: $10.9 billion annually, a 3.7% increase in electricity prices. And if that's on the Utility MACT, then the transport rule, there's 3,642 units at 1,081 power plant facilities affected by this. It applies to 28 states, including my home state of Arkansas. And the fact is that it will be impossible for these utilities and others to be able to get the work done in the short period of time that they're being allowed. Utilities cannot finance or install the billions of dollars of pollution control equipment that would be required in 6 months or even 3 years. Scrubbers 2 to 3 years at least are typically needed to finance, plan, design, obtain necessary permits, install, test, and start up new equipment. So in my opinion, this is a backdoor attempt at shutting down every coal plant in America. And coal is the most abundant, affordable supply of energy we have. We've got about a 225-year supply of it. And instead of turning our backs on it, we should be spending this time. And we should be making the kind of investments necessary to continue to find ways to clean it up. We've got a new coal plant going up right now near my hometown, near Hope, Arkansas. It's putting 1,700 people to work today as they build it. And when it comes online, it's going to be the cleanest coal plant in America. Why? Because it's going to be the newest coal plant in America. And I believe we should continue to hold the utilities' feet to the fire and continue to find ways to clean these things up. There's a lot of promise with carbon capture and sequestration, but we shouldn't pass rules that are basically going to shut them all down and leave this country with a huge shortage in electricity and with consumers with a very high electric bill if they're able to even get electricity. So this is a common sense approach. We're only asking for 6 months more time, and I support this amendment. I'm pleased to be authoring it with Congressman Whitfield, and I ask the members on both sides to give serious consideration to this bipartisan common sense amendment.
Gentleman's time expired. The chair will recognize Mr. Waxman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill we're considering today purports to be about regulatory analysis, but this amendment reveals what the real agenda has been all along. The real goal of the Train Act isn't to improve analysis of regulations, but to stop regulations, specifically to stop long overdue efforts to clean up old, polluting coal-fired power plants. The Whitfield Amendment indefinitely delays two critical Clean Air Act regulations that will allow hundreds of thousands of Americans to enjoy better health and save our economy tens of billions of dollars. The utility air toxics rule reduces emissions of mercury and other air toxics from power plants. EPA expects to finalize that regulation in November. The economic value of the benefits from lives saved and health improvements is 5 to 10 times greater than the costs. I thought the idea of the Train Act was to make sure that we're getting a cost-benefit analysis. Here we have a benefit that's 5 to 10 times greater than the costs. The cross-state air pollution rule reduces emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides that contribute to air pollution problems in downwind states. EPA finalized the rule last week. The health benefits for that rule, including lives saved and heart attacks and asthma attacks avoided, are over $100 billion per year. The cost of the utilities is less than $3 billion per year. In other words, each year these two rules will avoid tens of thousands of premature deaths. They will avoid tens of thousands of heart attacks and hospital admissions. They will avoid hundreds of thousands of aggregated asthma attacks. Americans will report to work or school on millions of days they would have otherwise missed due to illness. And these rules are projected to create new jobs manufacturing and installing pollution control equipment. This adds up to a healthier, more productive, and stronger economy. Many utilities support these rules. They knew the regulations were coming. They made the investments to clean up their pollution. These responsible businesses who played by the rules will be disadvantaged if Congress changes the rules mid-game. Some argue that these rules, together with other future EPA regulations, will lead to power plant shutdowns and threaten the reliability of the electric grid. These fears have been rebutted by analysis performed by the M.J. Bradley Group and the Bipartisan Policy Center, both of which found that the utility industry can meet the standards without harm to reliability. The utility industry had ample notice these rules were coming. The utility mercury rule is at least 10 years overdue, and earlier versions of both rules were finalized by George W. Bush administration, but overturned by the courts as insufficiently protective. The Whitfield Amendment leaves the earlier versions of the cross-state air pollution rule in place, but this approach still sacrifices significant benefits that would be achieved under the updated final cross-state air pollution rule. In 2012, the Whitfield Amendment would allow at least 1.5 million tons more SO2 and over 100,000 tons more NOx. This means more premature deaths, heart attacks, aggravated asthma attacks, respiratory diseases every year of delay. This amendment hurts downwind states that are trying to meet ambient air quality standards by their deadlines. Downwind states may have to impose more stringent controls on local businesses to make up for the effects of increased out-of-state pollution. That's more costly and it's not fair. The Whitfield Amendment also harms downwind states whose air pollution problems were not fixed under the earlier rule. Significantly, the amendment would delay reductions needed by Michigan, Louisiana, Texas, Wisconsin, and Illinois to meet the standards for fine particulate pollution or ozone. The cross-state air pollution rule was based on updated data. The Whitfield Amendment relies on old, less protective, less effective rule. The Train Act isn't about better analysis. The reams of analysis we have already show that these regulations are some of the best investments we could make. The Train Act is about stopping these regulations so that 50-year-old uncontrolled power plants never have to put on pollution controls. That's bad for public health, bad for the economy, bad for utilities, that played by the rules, and bad for jobs. This amendment to the Train Act is hijacking that Train Act, and it's going to take the whole thing and cause it to go into the ditch and never become law, which isn't a bad result, but it's not one that you would think the authors of this bill would want. Yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Chair would recognize Mr. Barton for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, back in the either the late 1980s or the early 1990s, then Chairman John Dingell took a congressional Codell trip to Europe, and part of that trip was to go to Poland to meet with the Solidarity Union, Lech Walesa. And I'll never forget, as the congressional plane flew into the Capitol, that you could literally see the air. And when we got to the airport and we got on the buses, I mean, you could literally see the air you were breathing. Because Poland at that point in time had old coal-fired power plants with no scrubbers, and they were using real soft, crumbly, almost lignite coal. Now, there's no question that the air that the Polish people at that time were breathing was an impairment to their health. Now, I have been a strong supporter of a strong environmental protection agency. I supported the Clean Air Act amendments in the early 1990s when John Dingell was chairman. And as we've gone through the Congress the last 20 years at various points, I've supported modifications to those. You know, I want clean air and I want clean water. I want rules that are fair. I want rules that are transparent. And I want rules that can be implemented without too negatively affecting our economy. The Obama EPA has apparently thrown out all the procedures that have been built up over the years to review these new rules, and they appear to have adopted a political decision that they're going to push every air regulation as far as they can, as fast as they can, and be damned with the truth. Now, I totally respect the former chairman of the committee, Mr. Waxman. I will submit for the record that he has been a strong advocate for the absolute strongest air quality regulations, not only in his home state of California, but in the United States. He is a true believer, and he has absolutely been true to the environmental creed in terms of trying to push for law that implements that. But to sit here and listen to him, and these are not his statistics, he's just regurgitating them, that these proposed rules are going to somehow save all these lives and prevent these premature deaths is absolute hogwash. There has not been one case, one, in the last 10 years of any instance of mercury poisoning because of air inhalation. Not one. Not one. Okay? In terms of...
Gentlemen, yield.
I'll be happy to yield.
You know, we have an environmental protection agency. They've done a lot of studies. All the
They
scientists
can't
say-
prove it.
Well,
Reclaiming my
they
time,
can't
Mr.
prove it,
Chairman.
but they
They
can
can't
prove
prove it. I have asked them for the records. I have asked them for the documents.
There's a cumulative effect
you
of
get
mercury.
homilies.
There's a
You
cumulative
get-
effect of these other.
You
emitters.
get absolutely nothing but regurgitated hogwash.
I think we're hearing that from you.
Now that's the truth. I'm not certified as a registered professional engineer at this point in time, but I have been in the past. And I would love to sit down with somebody at the EPA that would actually go through and prove these statistics. You know, what we know is this air transport rule that was put out yesterday or earlier this week in my home state of Texas, where, as far as I know, every power plant in the state is in total compliance on particulate matter and in total compliance on all the various mercury rules and regulations. 18 of them may have to shut down. And they've got till January to comply? I mean, that's not statistical analysis. That's not any kind of a cost benefit. EPA puts in their justification that they don't have to comply because the costs are not consequential. One paragraph. Now, what Mr. Whitfield is saying is, let's really do an analysis.
Gentlemen, yield.
I'll yield again.
The scientists have said that exposure to mercury causes children to have a difficult time to learn and to develop. Do you dispute that scientific finding?
I do not.
And so therefore, if we limit mercury pollution, we're limiting the harm to children who are going to be impeded by that mercury pollution in their development.
I'm reclaiming my time. I understand that mercury is a very toxic substance. But the EPA analysis earlier this year was off by a factor of 1,000. 1,000. So, you know, my time's expired, Mr. Chairman, but at some point in time, the folks that support these ever increasingly stringent rules need to put the facts on the table, and EPA has refused to do that. So the Whitfield Amendment is long overdue. It is prudent, and it should be passed.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent the gentleman be given 30 additional seconds if he'll yield to me.
Sure. Without objection, the gentleman will be recognized for a minute more.
I just want to point out that mercury is harmful to children in their development. And if you do things to limit the mercury pollution, you're limiting other pollutants as well. And that's important because other pollutants kill people. Mercury harms children. There's a clear benefit that would be accomplished in these rules from these coal-burning power plants that we were told in the 1970s were going to be out of business, so we shouldn't impose any restrictions on them. And now they're operating without any restrictions or without any limits on very dangerous pollutants, mercury being a toxic pollutant. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair would recognize the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've listened up real hard to this debate that's going on, and I couldn't help but think of the article that David Brooks wrote last week. And the article really refers to the thinking of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and that is that regardless of what, on the one hand, economists say from the across the political spectrum to scientists and what their consensus is, and he goes on and he develops it, but I think you get the point. I hope you've read it. I think that you might squirm in your seat when you read it because it is it's unsettling, but I think that there is truth interwoven between all of the sentences, and that's what this debate reminds me of, the David Brooks article. Regardless of what the science is, regardless of what we know about what is toxic, regardless of what we know it does to children and the cumulative effects it has on our population, regardless of what's been documented, of what these emissions do. You have a train act. It's aptly named. This is a train just running over the facts. Just running over the facts. Now, do I believe in analysis so that we know what the impacts are and what the costs are? Even when that is examined, it's said that these things are just made up. Each one of us has a responsibility, not only to our constituents, but collectively to the public health, obviously the businesses. There has been an analysis done. There is an effect in terms of downwind states relative to this amendment. The air pollution problems can't be fixed under under an earlier rule. But what to me is so disturbing is that regardless of the facts, the majority is willing to send a train down the track and run over them. Now, I don't know how many of you have taken the time and the trouble to read the letter that the American Lung Association sent to the chairman of the full committee, the ranking member of the full committee, and all the members. I don't know about you, but I respect them. Maybe you've gone to some of their local events and their ribbon cutting and shaken hands with them and said, we think you're doing a great job. Read the letter and what they say. Are they full of hot air? Excuse the expression. They've been around for a long time talking about and fighting for cleaner air and what stands in the way of that. So I think that there is, and I have a lot of affection and respect for Mr. Whitfield. I think that this is really an awful bill, and I think that this is really a dangerous amendment. And I think that it comes more out of despising the EPA, and that any regulation relative to the Clean Air Act is something that only despots would support. So, you know what? I think David Brooks was right. And I don't know how many of you have read it, but I think that you should. Because today's hearing is, it's like holding up a mirror. It's holding up a mirror and carrying out exactly what he spoke about. And I think it's a sad day for our country when we are sitting here legislating, rolling back what we know is the wrong way to go and what is harmful to the American people.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair would recognize Mr. Shimkus for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate, this is going to have strong debate and strong emotions on both sides. I think in Mr. Ross's opening statement, he talked about utility rate increases of 3.7%. I think over 3 years, utility increases are about 8.2%. And that's EPA's estimate. David Broder can't get elected in my district. I'd like for him to move to my district and run in my district, but he will not get elected. What I do know is that we've had numerous coal mines closed.
David Broder died.
Well, he definitely can't run in my district. In Chicago, he might, but yeah. So, I'm concerned about the folks in Southern Illinois who mine the coal, and for folks to say there's no permits on coal-fired power plants means that we didn't pass a Clean Air Act. Means that coal power generation isn't under any regulation. That's just untrue. Chairman Emeritus Barton was right in saying we have made great strides in air emissions over the years, at great cost to miners and at great cost to generating plants, at great cost to the prices that individuals pay, because when the generating plants conform to these new standards, they pass that price on to the consumers. And I think you can make the argument at great cost to our manufacturing base, because as that price increase was passed on to manufacturers, that makes it a little more difficult to be competitive in an international environment. So this is an amendment whose time has come to say, when we're in an economic crisis, why do we continue to move to create more regulatory burdens at a time when we're trying to create jobs? Why are we focused on creating more uncertainty in a world in which capital will not flow, or capital costs will be so high that we won't do the expands? Why don't we just pause and allow the economy to catch up and get back to 5% unemployment, where then we can try to do fix all the problems of the universe as is our like? But at this moment, it does not make sense to continue to harm the employers. If you want employers, you have to send the signals that we like what they're doing, and then the employers can have employees, which are our constituents. This continued attack on the fossil fuel sector and electricity generation by coal really impacts rural America and coal states, because as these power plants are pushed out of production, they are the largest job creator in the county. They are the largest taxpayer in the county. They fund the schools, they fund the cities, they fund the counties, they fund the environmental response, they fund the hospitals. And so as we talk about putting all the facts on the table, part of the facts of this debate is that we want these entities to continue to employ our constituents and continue to pay taxes, so that the health and the welfare and the benefit of rural America is taken in as much consideration as those who don't actually mine the coal and produce the electricity, but they just use the electricity. So we want the people who mine the coal, create the electricity, to get the same benefits as those who are using the electricity. So I appreciate the amendment from my colleague and my neighbor from Kentucky. And with that, I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair would recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word to speak against Chairman Whitfield's amendment. Mr. Chairman, the TRAIN Act is designed to make a train wreck out of a specific list of life-saving public health protections that are provided by the Clean Air Act. Now we have an amendment before us to delay EPA's mercury and air toxic standards for power plants, standards that will save thousands of lives each and every year. Power plants are the largest emitters of mercury and scores of other toxic air pollutants, and they are still failing to comply with the basic Clean Air Act requirements for toxic pollution over 2 decades after the adoption of the 1990 amendments. This situation is due to unlawful delays in standards by the prior administration that had resulted in the obligation by the present EPA to repropose and reissue lawful air toxic standards to protect the public. EPA's proposed mercury and air toxic standards for power plants will deliver enormous public health benefits. Were these standards to be delayed by even a single year, the potential magnitude of extreme health consequences would be significant. EPA has projected that by 2016, the proposed standards every year would avoid up to 17,000 premature deaths, 11,000 non-fatal heart attacks, 120,000 asthma attacks, and 850,000 days of people missing work. Mr. Chairman, why would we delay with saving that many lives? Why would we delay preventing that many asthma attacks? There is a huge economic cost in not doing so. in not implementing those standards immediately. In fact, we should really be working to do that here today. It's what our constituents want us to do. You know, I learned this firsthand when I recently received some test results showing, and I brought the results here, showing that I have personally an unsafe level of mercury in my body. I decided to take a clump of my hair and I sent it down to the University of Georgia to an independent lab, and this is the result I received back, that I have an unsafe level of mercury in my body. So I'd suggest that my colleagues might want to do the same thing. It costs $20, but it's worth knowing what impacts air pollution has on our bodies, along with other kinds of pollution, of course, as well. I think about that when I think about the vote that's coming before us to delay implementation of these rules. And I particularly think about it when I watch my daughter breastfeed her child, about 2 months old now, and I think about and I wonder what the level of mercury in her body is, that she may be passing on some toxic elements to her son through the wonderful act of breastfeeding. So this is a very personal situation, and I really believe that in the interest of public health, that there is an overwhelming public health benefit, plainly justifies the timely adoption of these vital safeguards. And I'm prepared to yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's no secret about my concerns about the coal industry as a whole. But as I hear my colleagues talk about invoking lives and babies and, you know, the risk and the cost of unhealthy environments, I just hope those same colleagues remember all the obstructionism that we continue to allow to stand in this country of providing alternatives. I just wonder, whenever they talk about building a new dam for hydroelectric in West Virginia, will the same individual stand up and say, look, EPA, look, Fish and Wildlife, we need to save lives and have a clean, non-polluting energy to be able to save lives? Are they willing to do that? When we talk about electrifying our auto industry, does anybody talk about the fact that we do not allow the mining of rare earth on our public lands in this country, which are essential for going to electrification of our auto industry? The fact is that there's 70 pounds of rare earth in every Prius. Is anybody willing to stand up and say, because we've got to allow the mining on our public lands to save the children, to save the lungs, to stop all this pollution? No, they're not willing to do that. And when we talk about renewables, are we willing to recognize that solar and wind not only has technological challenges, but when we do build it, the transmission lines are 3 times farther than traditional? Are we willing to now stand up to save the children? We will allow power transmission through our public lands rather than forcing them around the public lands. The same public lands allow freeways through, but won't allow renewable energy to be transmitted to our population centers. You know, my question is this: are we willing to take the same position against regulations that are stopping clean technologies and clean answers? Are we willing to be as tough and as compassionate when it comes to just eliminating the federal and state regulations that are standing in the way of clean alternatives? Are we willing to be that outrage about regulations that are causing problems at implementing clean technology as we are at going after the old plants that have been grandfathered through and maintained because the alternatives have not been economically available? That the regulatory system is designed to guarantee these plants be put and left and continue to operate in their historical approach. So I just really ask every colleague here who really says that mercury and emissions and the whole particulate issue is so important that we're willing to trash the economies of certain areas of this country to save lives. Are you willing to trash the federal regulations that are also blocking and causing the pollution to continue? Are you willing to change the way we do business as much as we're asking the areas in this country that have been using coal to change the way they do business? I just think there's a degree of insincerity here when it comes down to one industry, which I have not been a big ally of, but to point fingers at that industry when the fact of Washington's not willing to change the way we're doing business with our regulations. And I think that if we want to take that moral high ground and be able to invoke children and lives, then we have a responsibility to consider the fact that maybe we should lead through example and change the way Washington's been handling this issue. Now, I would just ask, I really think that a lot of these issues should be sent to the Energy Department and address what will be the alternative, what will be the impact, what are we doing to be able to make it possible economically and environmentally to phase out one technology and move the other. Are we willing to take the heat of providing a better alternative than what we're damning? And I haven't seen that in this body on both sides of the aisle, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy. I move to strike the last word, if you please. Mr. Chairman, our former colleague, now mayor of Chicago, once observed that a crisis is too good a thing to waste. We got a problem on our hands here. And I want to say this with respect to all of my colleagues. I think everybody in this room wants to solve the problem. Unfortunately, we seem to be hitched to a wide array of theological and disputatious positions. And the result is that the issues addressed in the Train Act, which are serious and require serious solutions, are probably not going to be addressed in the bill, nor are they probably going to become law to take care of the problems that the industry and the environmentalists and everybody else feels are a real problem. Unhappily, there are a lot of people running around here who want to eviscerate EPA. I yield to no one in having been angry at EPA for some of the high-handed, arrogant, and ignorant things that they have done down there. But the harsh fact of the matter is they're the only EPA we've got, and I don't think eviscerating them is in the interest of anybody. So I think what we have to do is to recognize that the gutting of EPA's budget and EPA is not good, and that we are going to have to understand that there's some legitimate problems. It's fairly easy to identify the problems. One of the biggest single problems we got is the coal ash problem. And it's to be fairly simple to simply identify that coal ash is a problem that probably has to, because of its peculiar character, to be treated separately and distinctly. That's fairly easy to do. Let's figure out what's wrong with the way EPA is handling coal ash. Let's figure out what ought to be done to make the solution work. And then let's begin to address it. Now, I'm just a poor Polish lawyer from Detroit. And I think that if we will approach that and deal with these matters in a more surgical fashion, and we can get down to dealing with the specific concerns we have, whether we have coal ash as a separate category, or whether it's treated as a hazardous waste, or whether it's treated as a household waste, I don't think is a matter for any kind of theological discussion. All we really got to do is figure out what it is are the problems, and then figure out how we're going to come up with a solution. I think the solution could be fairly simple, and that is to find out how we're going to deal with the impoundment question. Deal with the impoundment question, let EPA write the regulations, and dispose of the problem. So I'm going to be sitting here in the rather unfortunate position of having to vote against both the Train Act and a lot of the associated amendments. And I hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will work together to solve this problem in an efficient and a reasonable and a competent way. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, when you look at this stuff, you wonder how much longer is the Obama administration going to punish the American people in this economy. These things have great cost to our economy and the American people. The transport rule just For example, according to EPA's estimates, the projected annualized compliance costs are $1.4 billion in 2012 and $800 million in 2014. The new rule applies to 27 states in the eastern half of the United States and affects 3,642 electric generating units at 1,081 facilities. Facilities in Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma would be subject not only to the seasonal NOx program with limits that are proposed to take effect in 2012. The utility MAC is a hugely expensive rule. According to EPA, this rule would affect 24% of the nation's electricity generation, 1,350 coal and oil-fired units at 525 power plants. New compliance cost of this regulation is $10.9 billion annually. This has the potential of being EPA's most expensive rule on the U.S. economy, hurting jobs in the economy. And I want to thank Chairman Whitfield for offering this amendment to my bill. This is a very important amendment. I think it's going to help a lot. And as we can see by EPA's actions on the utility sector alone, they are issuing multiple regulations on top of each other at such an accelerated rate that it makes it difficult for companies to invest and create jobs. This is EPA's regulatory train wreck. The Utility MAC rule alone has the potential to be EPA's most expensive rule impacting the U.S. economy. Combined, they will cost tens of billions on the economy and hurt job growth. According to NARA Economic Consulting, an analysis of these proposed rules could cost $17.8 billion to implement, and the result is a net employment loss of 1.44 million jobs in America. Reports out recently we aren't creating jobs, and these are private sector jobs that we need desperately. These rules will force the premature retirement of power plants, raise electricity rates on families and businesses alike, and hurt our global competitiveness. If there is one thing that can help our struggling economy, it's having access to stable and reliable sources of energy. I'm pleased to support this common sense amendment to delay EPA's action on both the Utility MAC and the Transport Rule until 6 months after the Train Act analysis is complete. This delay is prudent in light of our national unemployment rising to 9.2% over the past month, and I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Chairman Whitfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sullivan. And there has been a lot of discussion today about mercury, which we're all very much concerned about. But I would point out that under Utility MAC, 99.99996% of the benefit comes from reduction of particulate matter. Now, in these amendments, we are not advocating the repeal of any of these regulations, even though the Utility MAC is the most expensive, comprehensive regulation ever issued by EPA. I don't think anyone would object to additional analysis, and that's all we're doing here. We want additional analysis. Let's look at what is the impact on the competitiveness of the United States against other businesses and countries around the world as a result of these regulations. 50% of electricity produced in America comes from coal. And when you start putting regulations like this, you impact the price of electricity. That affects jobs. And I doubt that there's one member on this committee that has any idea or can explain in any way the modeling and the assumptions used at EPA in calculating health benefits. Now, we've heard this morning that there's going to be 17,000 premature deaths, less premature deaths if we move these regulations, 850,000 days of people not missing work if we move these regulations. How is that really determined? And the question I mentioned when I first talked about this amendment, these assumptions at EPA, they may look at health benefits up in the Northeast for the reduction of pollutants, but what about the children of unemployed utility workers and coal miners in the Midwest? They don't look at the assumptions of the cost of their lack of health care. And so all we're asking is, let's delay the implementation of these two rules until we can look more thoroughly at the impact. We're not saying repeal it. Let's just look at it. Even President Obama, in today's Energy Daily, concerned about unemployment, concerned about the impact of these regulations, he issued another executive order and said we need to relook at this, and maybe we need to even repeal some of them. So I believe that this amendment that we're talking about today, that Mr. Ross and I have introduced, is a modest, simply, let's take a little time, let's analyze, and let's fully understand what we're talking about. So I want to thank the gentleman for yielding his time to me.
Chair would recognize Mr. Rush for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
The bill we're considering today purports to be about regulatory analysis, but this amendment reveals what the real agenda has been all throughout this effort. I'm from a coal-producing state, and I'm also come from a district that is suffering many health issues, and health problems permeate many of those who are in my district, including birth defects and other kinds of illnesses and diseases that can be attributed in great measure to the environmental conditions that some of the people in my district are forced to live with. And I must say that the real goal of this Train Act isn't to improve, as been argued most vociferously by the members of the other side. It's not to improve the analysis of regulations, but it has one goal and one goal in mind only, and that is to stop the EPA, to stop regulations, specifically to stop long overdue efforts to clean up old, polluting, coal-fired power plants, 2 of which is in my city, the Crawford Power Plant and the 5th Power Plant. And my friend, Mr. Whitfield, the chairman of the subcommittee, of which I serve as ranking member, is a good guy, well-intentioned. But I know for a fact, and it's obvious to everyone here, that the purpose of this amendment is to indefinitely delay 2 critical clean air regulations that will allow hundreds of thousands of American people throughout the nation, including those in my district, to enjoy better health and to save our economy tens of billions of dollars. Mr. Chairman, I want to just say that the utility air toxics rule reduces emissions of mercury and air toxins from power plants. The EPA is on the record that it expects to finalize the regulation in November. The economic value of benefits from lives saved and health improvements has been stated categorically by many learned and expert individuals, organizations, and others. The improvements is 5 to 10 times greater than the cost. The cross-state air pollution rule reduces emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides that contribute to air pollution problems in downwind states. EPA finalized that rule last week. Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman, we are asking for some kind of standard, some kind of study. Well, in 2011, there was a report issued by the University of Massachusetts Political Economy Research Institute, and they found that meeting new standards that limit sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, mercury, and other pollutants will create, in the report's own word, jobs for the American people. As a matter of fact, I quote them. They say a wide array of skilled construction and professional jobs, from the electricians, plumbers, laborers, and engineers who will build and retrofit power plants all across the eastern United States, to operations and maintenance. O&M employees will keep these modernized facilities running. The utility companies themselves, the largest utility companies in this nation, the most successful utility companies in this nation, they support the EPA's rules. They're not marching lockstep into our offices, lobbying against these rules. They are in favor of these rules. They knew beforehand, just like every utility company in the nation knew beforehand, that these regulations were coming. They knew that they were coming. And these individuals, these companies, these responsible companies, these companies that do create jobs and are the engines for economic viability in this nation, they didn't say, well, we're going to stand back and fight these amendments. They got ahead of the curve. They made the investments to clean up their pollution, to retrofit their factories and their plants. These responsible businesses played by the rules, and they will be severely disadvantaged. You will hurt these and harm these responsible businesses who you purport to protect, you to purport to advocate for. You're going to hurt them, harm them, take monies out of their pockets if this Congress change the rules in the mid-game after they have made these millions and billions of dollars in investments. My own utility company, Exelon, has made millions and billions of dollars in investment. And I tell you, my friend from California, you ask, what am I willing to do? I am not willing to allow this company that supplies jobs and helps clean up the environment in my district, I am not going to allow their investments to go down the drain because of this train.
Gentleman's time is.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Dr. Burgess.
Thank the Chairman for the recognition. You know, utility companies may have known, some utility companies may have known for some time that this rule was coming. I would submit to you the state of Texas was absolutely caught off guard by, at the last minute, being included in this rule. The administration, unfortunately, has a long and established track record of wanting to punish success. Up until last week, I thought that was just punishing successful individuals and companies. Now we see it is aimed at punishing successful states. Chairman Whitfield correctly articulated that there are strict standards for mercury emissions prior to this rule. There will be strict standards for mercury emissions afterwards. It is not going to change that. But what it will change is the ability for Texas companies to provide power generation for their citizens. 2 times in the last 6 months. One was February, 3 days before the Super Bowl, and power production was severely curtailed during a cold snap in the state of Texas. And then 2 weeks ago, the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas asked people to voluntarily reduce consumption because it was a very hot day and air conditioners were running and they could not keep up with the power demands. Now, what happens when you lose your air conditioning in the summer in Texas? It gets extremely hot extremely quickly. Now, Mr. Rush may remember, we heard some hypotheticals about premature deaths that would be prevented by enacting this EPA rule, but what about facts? And Mr. Rush may remember in the city of Chicago several years ago, you had a very hot spell one summer. It was toward the end of the summer, and you lost, I think it was 800 of your citizens due to heat-related deaths, predominantly affecting the very elderly. What about Paris, France? Remember the summer of 2003? Remember how people said that going into Iraq was going to cause the greatest humanitarian disaster that ever occurred? But where was the humanitarian disaster that summer? It was in Paris, France, because they had a very hot spell over a holiday weekend, and 11,000 people died because they did not have access to climate control in their houses, and they weren't checked on because their relatives had gone on holiday. Heat-related deaths in the summertime can be a very serious phenomenon. But what does this rule do? This rule removes, some 18 power plants in the state of Texas, those that depend on lignite coal for their power production. All we are asking is for someone at the federal agency to do a nonpartisan, non-ideological cost-benefit analysis of this proposed rule before it is enacted. I don't think that's asking too much. I don't think that's jeopardizing public health and safety and public welfare. I think shutting down 18 power plants in the state of Texas when we have
Will the gentleman yield?
I will not yield for just a moment. Let me finish this thought. I think 2 episodes of having to curtail power production in Texas in the last 6 months shows that we are operating very close to the margin on that. If you close down 18 power plants in the state of Texas, there are going to be severe problems, yes, in the summer. There are going to be severe problems in the winter because, yes, we do have cold winters in the state of Texas despite global warming. This is a serious problem for our state. It is going to affect productivity. It is going to affect jobs. It's going to affect employment. And the fact of the matter is, it came at us at the last minute. There was no discussion of this prior to 10 days ago. So it is extremely important that, again, in a nonpartisan, non-ideologic fashion, a cost-benefit analysis be performed. I know this administration does not like to do cost-benefit analyses. We've seen that over and over and over again with the closure of automobile dealerships, with some of the stuff in the health care law. But this time, it is important to do that cost-benefit analysis. This economy is in critical shape, in case you hadn't noticed. People across the country are so frightened of what is happening to our economy. Let's not take an axe to it in the state of Texas, the one state that, in fact, is showing a few bright spots as far as employment. And I'll be happy to yield to my colleague from Chicago.
Yeah, I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. I do remember the 700 people who died in the early 90s in the summer of Some of them were my neighbors, some of them were my constituents. But let me just tell you what my utility company did as a result of that.
You're just reclaiming my time. This is not about the fact that your utility company knew this rule was coming ahead of time. Reclaiming my time. This is the fact that the state of Texas had no idea that this rule was coming. And 10 days ago,
retrofitting and upgrading their plant.
Force this rule
$1 billion.
Texas. I yield back to the chairman.
The gentleman from Texas controls the time, and his time has now expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Chakowski.
Well, thank you for recognizing. First, I'd like to yield 30 seconds to my colleague from Chicago.
I want to thank the gentlelady. My utility company, as a result, they didn't rely on some act of Congress, all right, to try to correct the problem that they found existed that resulted in these massive deaths. They acted responsibly, invested over $1 billion, in accordance with the EPA standard, and retrofitted and made improvements to their power plants. They didn't sit back and wait for the moment in time when their friends were in power and then their friends could circumvent the aspirations and the well-being of the American people and of the citizens that they and their customers. They got out in front of it and made some major investments. I want to thank the gentleman.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time. A number of members today have said on a number of occasions that the Clean Air Act is responsible for killing coal mining jobs and putting the children of miners at risk. Well, actually, last April, we asked the Congressional Research Service to examine this issue. So I have a chart that I hope we can put up that shows the results. Can we put that up on the screen? And if it gets there, you'll see that there it is. That coal mining jobs, which is the red line, started to precipitously decline long before the Clean Air Act amendments. You can see that those entered about halfway down on the chart. They were enacted in 1990. And you know what happened after that? Production of coal has only increased. In fact, coal production has increased 30% since 1980, even while the number of mining jobs has dropped by 60%. So the Clean Air Act did not cause these job losses. Instead, it's the same cause that we've seen in many industries. It's mechanization. Now, I am more than willing to acknowledge that government isn't always the solution, but I hope that my colleagues across the aisle can acknowledge that this problem has simply been misdiagnosed. It is not the cause of the unemployment in the industry is not caused by the Clean Air Act. And we can, in fact, have both. We can have a reliable source of energy in this country, and we can have clean air. That is the goal here, that we don't have to pick on whether our children become sick because of pollution or that they become poor because there are no jobs. We can have clean energy in this country, and we can have clean air and healthy children in this country. The Clean Air Act is not the cause of job loss. And I would be happy to yield if anyone wants the time. Mr. Barton.
Just want to point out that your chart is absolutely true, but what it doesn't show is that the hard rock underground miners in the east with high sulfur coal plummeted, and the low sulfur open pit mined coal in the west skyrocketed. So the total number of jobs did decline because of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, but coal production maintained itself and went up because they substituted coal from the west that were strip mined in open coal mines for coal that was underground mined in the east that tended to be the anthracite, harder, high sulfur coal.
Well, reclaiming my time, as my colleague from Illinois has said, Mr. Rush, there are those utility companies and mining companies who had the foresight to do what is needed in order to comply with the Clean Air Act. And the answer in 2011 is not to say that we are now going to explore reducing the important safeties that have been introduced to keep us all well. We've had the same arguments about jobs and the environment when it comes to mercury, one of the most toxic chemicals in our environment. I, for one, am not willing to go back to those days where we decide that we have to trade off having toxic pollutants that are hurting our children, that are hurting our families, in order to preserve jobs. Those are not the only options on the table, and I suggest that we look at those others so that we can have a better economy and a healthier populace, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's remember what this bill does, the TRAIN Act. It actually calls upon the administration to use their cabinet members to tell us what the impact is of what the EPA is doing. this committee passed last year, as I recall, and it went to the floor, a bill that had a similar appointment of officials to deal with some other job issues. So either we trust the administration or we don't, but in this case, this is to ask the administration to do that which it doesn't want to do, and that is to come up with an economic and job analysis of these. Now, there also is a health analysis of this, and this is critically important because nobody here in this room or who is a member of Congress wants to have problems with air, land, and water. We want them cleaned up. But the issue is make sure we're using hard science and look at these from a number of levels. Also, as Congress is dealing with a massive debt and deficit, let's keep in mind that poverty is one of the biggest contributors also to environmental problems. And that is when you have people who are desperate for jobs, they may not be looking at some of these other issues here too. When we have the money in the economy to clean up our power plants and do other things, we can invest it. With the June unemployment rate of 9.2%, keep this in mind, that we had, if you look at that, turns into 18,000 jobs. That's about 360 jobs per state. That's not even worth about one graduating class per state from a typical large American high school. In June of 2011, total high school graduates in America was 3.7 million. College graduates was 1.7 million. We have to be thinking of ways we can grow jobs. Now, a 1% decline in unemployment, is $90 billion in federal revenue in 1 year. So while we're looking at other ways of increasing revenue, instead of raising taxes, let's increase the number of taxpayers. A decrease in unemployment compensation and decrease in federal revenues all comes with that. And what we're asking the administration to do is keep this in mind and give us some analysis as all this goes forth. So while the President, the Speaker, and other members are over at the White House trying to figure out ways of dealing with the reduction of our debt and our deficit, let's keep in mind the biggest part of that also is increasing the number of jobs. And this bill is asking for some of that analysis to take place. What do we have to fear with truth? And I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you very much. There has been some discussion today about certain utility companies actually support the Utility MACT and Air Transport Rule, and that is true, including some in Mr. Rush's area. And all of us are fans and proponents of nuclear energy. Exelon is a great company, but they use nuclear energy, so I don't think they're going to be too concerned about the impact on coal with these regulations. Yeah, this right here is the rule for the air transport. This is supposed to take effect on January 1st, just a few months away. And as I've said, independent analysis have looked at the assumptions made by EPA, and many of these entities are concerned that they've made a lot of mistakes in their assumptions. So I would just reiterate once again, I genuinely believe that Congress does have the responsibility to make sure that analyses are complete. And it's been said more than once today, all we're asking for is a more in-depth analysis looking at electricity prices, looking at competitiveness, looking at fuel costs, looking at impact on unemployment. And I would just ask a question once again, when we talk about health benefits, and Mr. Waxman mentioned $100 billion in health benefits. And when you really think about these models being used, how do they determine, for example, how many 10-year-olds and below are coming down with asthma, or how many 70-year-olds and above may have a premature death if this regulation does not pass? How is that done? What assumptions are being used? Now, those are questions that we're asking, and as I've said now for the third time, these analyses still do not take into effect the damage to the health care of children whose parents will lose jobs because of these regulations. That is a cost that we also ought to explore. So I think it's a reasonable approach. We're not trying to repeal anything here. We need additional time for a more comprehensive look. And I would yield back.
The gentleman yield.
I'd be happy to yield.
Well, it seems to me that if you have questions, we had to have hearings. We had to have regular order. But these issues are being dropped on another bill as amendments, as if we knew exactly what we all agreed to do, and we don't agree on it. You don't have the analysis. These power plant emission standards for the eastern states benefit primarily the Northeast while hurting the Midwest. That's what you said, but that's not the case at all. There are other things I want to go into. I know your time has expired, but my point briefly is we should have had a hearing. We should know what the consequences are. This is too important an issue just to offer amendments on another bill and bring it up in full committee without getting the information.
Well, I may just make one other comment if I could. One of the concerns has been the very short comment period that EPA has allowed on these very comprehensive and complex rules.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak in opposition or in support of the amendment? Seeing gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I want to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to respond to some of the things that have been said. Chairman Whitfield suggested earlier that the new power plant emission standards for the eastern states benefit primarily the Northeast while hurting the Midwest. That's not the case. As I understand it, according to EPA, starting in 2014 on an annual basis, some of the largest benefits of the new cross-state air pollution rule occur in the Midwest and the South. For example, in both Michigan and Kentucky, we'll avoid up to 1,400 premature deaths and provide monetized benefits of up to $11 billion. In Ohio, we'll avoid up to 3,200 premature deaths and provide monetized benefits up to $26 billion. In Texas, we'll avoid up to 1,700 premature deaths and provide monetized benefits of up to $14 billion. This rule will prevent tens of thousands of premature deaths and asthma attacks across the country, not just in New England, and those are the facts. Chairman Whitfield suggested earlier new power plant emission standards for the eastern states benefit primarily. So I think that we need to be mindful that, that this is important for the many parts of the country, and that it's a good reason we should have a hearing. I've cited facts and figures. I've gotten them, of course, from EPA and others who've done an analysis. Some of these rules they've been working on for a decade, and now that they finally have come about with one rule and they're talking about another one later, it just seems to be so inappropriate to drop a repeal of those rules on another piece of legislation without and I don't think they're related, except if you look at them in both in terms of trying to stop regulations, not to analyze them more carefully. I yield back the balance of my time. Yeah, I yield to Mr. Rush.
On this issue of jobs, I really want us to be real clear about what the facts are. According to the employment effects, an EPA study, the employment effects on the planned changes in EPA's to the EPA's air pollution rules. In the matter of jobs under pollution controls, there would be an increase of 305,000 jobs. Direct and those are direct jobs. Direct and indirect jobs, there will be an increase of 683,734 jobs. New generation capacity, 312,617 new jobs. Direct and indirect, 774,151 new direct and indirect jobs, for a total of 637,922 new jobs that are direct, and 1,457,885 direct and indirect jobs. The employment estimates of net O&M jobs associated with capital improvements and retirement of coal generation under pollution controls, there would be a total of 2,167 net jobs created, direct and indirect 4,254 jobs. The purpose of this and the conclusion that anyone would draw is that the EPA, under its rules, have been creating jobs. It's a job creator, not a jobs killer. And I really don't understand what it's going to take for the majority to come to grips with this and to admit this and to acknowledge this. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Whitfield and Mr. Ross. Are all those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Roll call is asked for. The clerk will call the tally.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bonomack. Ms. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Ms. Myrick. Ms. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, aye. Ms. McMorris Rogers. Ms. McMorris Rogers, aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, aye. Mr. Lance, no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Waxman. No. Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle. No. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. No. Mr. Towns, no. Mr. Rush.
No.
Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshoo? No. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Yes. Mr. Green, yes. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, no. Ms. Capps? Ms. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Schukowski? Ms. Schukowski, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Yes. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield? No. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Ms. Christensen? Ms. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, no. Chairman Upton?
Votes aye.
Chairman Upton, aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Stearns?
Mr. Stearns, aye.
Mr. Rogers?
Mr. Rogers, aye.
Dr. Burgess?
Mr. Burgess, aye.
Mr. Gardner?
Mr. Gardner, aye.
Mr. Pallone? No.
Mr. Pallone, no.
Mr. Matheson, no. Are there other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 27, and we had Burgess, Rogers, Stearns, Garner, so that's 31. 3117 is what I have.
Mr. Chairman, on that, there were 32 ayes and 18 noes.
18 noes. The amendment is agreed to. Are there other members wishing to offer an amendment? The gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, and it's number D01.
Clerk will report the title.
Would you repeat the number again, please, ma'am?
D01.
Amendment to H.R. 2401, offered by Ms. Capps.
Amendment will be considered as read. The staff will pass the amendment out, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I said when I introduced the amendment in the subcommittee, it is my hope that we can all simply agree to this amendment. It's still my hope, and the full committee. The TRAIN Act requires a committee of cabinet secretaries to analyze and thus potentially delay long overdue safeguards that provide vital public health protections. Delays in implementing these protections would lead to tens of thousands of premature deaths every year. In my view, the studies required under the TRAIN Act are redundant, and they waste agency time and they waste taxpayer money. Indeed, both the EPA and the OMB already performed the studies mandated by the TRAIN Act. Additionally, numerous executive orders and regulatory review laws require similar analyses. That's why I have put forth this straightforward amendment. It would make certain that the committee created by the TRAIN Act would perform analyses to the extent that they are feasible, given the available information, the limitations of economic modeling, and available funding. It also allows the committee to complete the analyses to the extent that the information produced is useful to policymakers and stakeholders. If analyses are not feasible or not useful, we should not be spending taxpayer resources on them. My amendment also charges the committee to carry out the law in such a way that it doesn't delay or interfere with other statutory or legal obligations. I consider this to be simply common sense. It attempts to make this task more manageable given the time and resource limitations before us. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I am prepared to yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, if no one else is.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 5.
I support the Capps amendment. As drafted, the TRAIN Act will create a new government bureaucracy to conduct a biased and burdensome study about the cumulative cost impacts of important regulations established by the EPA to protect public health and the environment. The bill would require a dizzying array of analyses of EPA, state and local rules, some of which have not been finalized or even proposed yet. As a result, this legislation is likely to produce a report that is full of guesswork and that could dramatically over or underestimate the true costs of the programs. This guesswork comes with a hefty price tag for taxpayers. The bill also gives the new government bureaucracy a very limited amount of time to complete this complicated study of EPA rules. EPA's past reports to examine cumulative costs and benefits serve as an example of how long it takes to produce a truly meaningful and substantive analysis. EPA recently finalized a prospective study of the cumulative costs and benefits of the Clean Air Act itself. EPA spent 10 years to complete the study, taking the time needed to develop a state-of-the-art analytical design and execute a study that was reviewed by OMB and outside experts. This study confirmed the tremendous benefits of the Clean Air Act. If the committee is going to approve this legislation, then we should work to make sure that the report it produces is more than a hastily drafted, educated guess It should actually be useful to policymakers. That seems like a reasonable threshold for a $4 million project. The CAPS amendment is designed to do just that. This amendment is common sense. If analyses are not feasible or not useful, we should not be spending taxpayers' resources on them. I urge my colleagues to support the CAPS amendment. And I yield to anybody else who wishes me to yield on either side of the dais. If not, I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are the other members? Mr. Whitfield is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment simply because the amendment would actually defeat the entire purpose of the Train Act by giving the committee the freedom to determine whether or not they want to limit the study or not do the study or change it or whatever. My response to this amendment is to simply reiterate what we've already said. These regulations are so comprehensive. We've primarily been talking about two of them today, the Utility Act and the so-called air transport rule, but there are about 10 others. And really the analysis we're requiring under the Train Act are not really much different than what the President is requiring under his executive order, which does not seem to be abided by. In fact, yesterday he came out with another executive order and said we need to review these things because I'm very much concerned about the impact on unemployment. And I would just reiterate once again, all we're asking for is let's look at the impact that it has on the ability of the U.S. to compete in the global marketplace. Let's look at the impact on electricity costs. Let's look at the impact on unemployment. Let's look at the assumptions being made by EPA, because I don't think any entity or any group outside of a few think tanks have really analyzed the assumptions made by EPA, and those assumptions basically drive the analysis. As a matter of fact, I think EPA could get any result that it wanted on benefits by applying certain assumptions. And none of us really know what those assumptions are. And the Train Act, if we pass it, it does get into the assumptions as well. So I would respectfully request that we defeat the gentlelady from California's amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the CAPS amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The noes appear to have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Are there other members wishing to offer?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, number 2, the Rush-Christensen amendment.
The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2401, offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois and Ms. Christensen of Virgin Islands.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes in support of.
Mr. Chairman, last week during the subcommittee markup, I offered an amendment in good faith that I thought would help make this bill more balanced by including language that would direct the committee created under this act to look at the public health and environmental impacts associated with EPA regulations instead of only the cost to industry as the bill currently does. During that subcommittee markup, my distinguished colleague from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, asked why my amendment only directed the committee to look at reductions in public health impacts such as asthma, developmental defects, and missed school and work days, among others, and not increases as well. Well, I thought that Mr. Griffin made a valid point. And in the spirit of trying to work in a bipartisan spirit of bipartisanship, trying to work together in good faith, I directed my staff to go back and make some changes to the language of my amendment to ensure that it would take into account both the positive and the negative impacts of health and environmental consequences of EPA's regulations. So the amendment I am offering today reflects those changes to the language that the majority requested. My amendment would still add the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, as well as the Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, among others, to the interagency council that this bill would create. Additionally, my amendment would direct the committee to look at important health impacts that would be affected by EPA's proposed rules, including the effects on vulnerable subpopulations such as the elderly, such as pregnant women, and populations with pulmonary disease, as well as the environmental impacts on global climate change and the effect of promoting clean energy jobs and clean energy technologies. Mr. Chairman, it is my hope that my amendment will be supported by the majority side with the expectation that it will strengthen this bill by making sure that this new committee takes a balanced and unbiased approach that looks at costs as well as benefits from proposed EPA regulations. By including health and environmental impacts of proposed EPA rules instead of just cost to industry, as I said beforehand, this bill has a much better chance of having bipartisan support as it moves its way through the legislative process. So, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield such time as anyone may want. If not, I yield back. I yield to the chairman, to the ranking member of the full committee.
This amendment assures that there be some balance in this inquiry. The bill creates a new government bureaucracy to conduct a complicated study of EPA's rules. At a minimum, we should ensure that the committee and the committee's product are balanced. The Rush amendment would do just that. As currently drafted, the bill requires an unbalanced and inherently biased study. The bill requires this interagency committee to look at economic and cost impacts, but it does not require the committee to look at economic benefits of EPA's rules, such as reducing the number of hospital visits due to asthma attacks and improving the efficiency of the economy by cutting down missed work days. The bill requires an examination of impacts on small businesses and agriculture, but not vulnerable subpopulations in developing infants and children. The Rush Amendment would correct that imbalance. This amendment would ensure that the makeup of the committee is balanced by ensuring that departments and offices with expertise in health, disease, and environmental quality can participate. Even with this amendment, I'm worried that the analysis proposed will be burdensome and impossible to complete given the scope and timing required by the bill, but at least the balance by this amendment is essential. I urge my colleagues to support the Rush-Christensen amendment.
Other members wishing to speak on the amendment?
Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman.
from Oklahoma, Mr. Sullivan. Recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to speak in opposition to the amendment. The Train Act specifically calls for an analysis of cumulative benefits in Section 3B, Section 1. This does not preclude health benefits from being considered, and in fact, health benefits have already been considered by the EPA for their most expensive rules and actions covered under my bill. The cumulative impact of rules is not limited to either negative or positive, but the opponents of the bill apparently believe those impacts outlined in my bill are only negative and have asked that positive cumulative impacts be specifically required. I believe assessing how the global competitiveness of the United States is impacted by EPA rules and regulations is a positive undertaking to understand the cumulative impact of EPA's regulatory train wreck. I feel the same way towards looking at how the EPA regulations will result in changes to electricity prices, electric reliability, jobs, small businesses, and local governments. The EPA in many cases doesn't look at these criteria when issuing these expensive regulations, which is why the Train Act is so important. To address these claims, the APA rules, the Utility Act, and new transport rules, now cross-state air pollution rules, offer billions of dollars in health benefits. And I'd like to yield back the balance of my time to Chairman Whitfield if he needs to speak on this.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding. I would just say that I know that the other side are concerned about cumulative benefits, and the contents of the Train Act on page 3 specifically says that we will look at cumulative cost and cumulative benefits. So that's already a part of this legislation. And then the fact that we have so many cabinet level officers on this committee, as well as the administrator of EPA, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. All of these things, I think, provides adequate width and broad basis of knowledge in the federal government to be a part of this. And so for that reason, I would oppose the amendment as well. And I'd yield back the balance of the time to the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Gentleman yields back his time.
I yield back.
Other members wishing to speak? Gentlelady, the Virgin Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm really pleased to be able to co-sponsor this amendment with a distinguished ranking member of the Subcommittee on Energy and Power and a gentleman who always stands up for what's right and fair and just. One of my very first markups since coming back to the committee was H.R. 910, which essentially denied that greenhouse gases contributed to the escalation of climate change, and the discussion also included doubts that they were injurious to public health. That bill would prohibit EPA from regulating greenhouse gases to address these important impacts, and so I should not be surprised, but I am, that not only an unnecessary, impossible to administer bill would be introduced, but that it would be so blatantly one-sided, ignoring the very reason why EPA has the responsibility to promulgate regulations, which is to protect the well-being and health of all of us who live in this country. I know that my colleagues don't mean to put a cost on life and health, but that's exactly what this bill does. It only directs the committee it would create to study costs, the impacts on business, the economy, and so forth. It really ignores the health impact. And I know that health and life and the full and healthy development of our children are paramount to all of us. This amendment, the Rush-Christensen amendment, would create a broader committee with additional expertise on the environment, climate, and public health. It would bring a more comprehensive approach to the analytic process that the committee is being created to carry out. Without representation from the Department of Interior, Health and Human Services, and NIH's Institute on Environmental Services, the narrow interest of the committee as created in the base bill would omit factors important to our environment and our health, not assessing at all the purpose of the regulation it is to analyze. And it would do nothing to look at the jobs the regulations might create. It only looks at the ones that might be lost. It's, as the ranking member said, it's an unbalanced approach. I know that as the gentleman from Oklahoma and the chairman stated, there are some areas to be reported on and that are rather vague, but if it were the intent of the sponsors to have the factors this amendment would include addressed in those areas, then there should be no objection to having it clearly spelled out as the Rush-Christensen amendment would do. I don't know if there's anything that could make this bill better, but this is an attempt to do so. And while I'm not sure that I'm going to support the entire bill, this amendment would at least make the committee look at all factors, including job creation and climate change, but most importantly, the impacts on health of our fellow Americans. And so I thank Congressman Rush for developing it and for allowing me to be a co-sponsor of this important amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith.
Mr. Chairman, I believe there's an amendment to the amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the title.
An amendment to the amendment offered by Mr. Griffith of Virginia.
The amendment to the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will circulate the amendment, and the gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I realize that my amendments to the amendment may not convince my colleagues on this side of the aisle to vote for Mr. Rush's underlying amendment because of the first page and the first couple of lines on page 2, but we did have a discussion in subcommittee, and at that time I indicated that I would like to make some amendments, and some of that is, I believe, attempted in the Rush amendment, but I don't think it goes far enough. One, I think we need to be clear when dealing with bureaucratic agencies that we want both the positive and negative changes, not just changes. I think we end up with a net change when we do that, so you see that language. You'll also see that I went into the other paragraphs dealing with the effects on air quality, particularly K, but I put them all in there because I think it's important that we see both the positive and negative changes, not just the net change in there, and the positive and negative effects. And then I added a paragraph P, which I think is very important. We constantly get into debates in the subcommittee and in this full committee regarding the quality of air and so forth, and yet we have heard testimony on several occasions that when we send our jobs overseas by making our costs too high to do business in the United States, that we may have a negative impact on air outside of the United States of America, and I don't believe that the EPA has been studying that. Thus, I offer this amendment to Mr. Rush as an improvement on his amendment. Again, I don't think it solves the problems in the first part, but I think it solves the problems in the second part of Mr. Rush's amendment, and thus I offer it, understanding full well that should it be adopted, that while my colleagues may not support it, I will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Yeah. I thank the gentleman for yielding. We did have a discussion during the subcommittee markup, and I indeed made modifications to my amendment. On page 2, lines E to O, we changed the phrase, quote, any resulting reductions, end of quote, to read, and I again quote, any resulting change, end of quote, which of course covers both positive and negative changes. So if the gentleman would agree to work with me on the language in paragraph P, which he introduced, then I'll be willing to support his amendment. I propose that we make paragraph P neutral by adding the phrase any resulting change to before impact, and adding or decrease after increase, and adding on coming to after leaving. So the modified paragraph P would read, any resulting change to the impact of increased or decreased air pollution in the air of the northern hemisphere by virtue of jobs leaving or coming to the U.S. to countries in the northern hemisphere that do not have substantially similar laws and regulations of the United States of America. And that's it. And if the gentleman will agree to work with me with these language, then I'll support his amendment to the amendment.
If in order, I would accept those amendments to the amendment to the amendment. If in order. I'm not sure it's in order, Mr. Chair.
You ask unanimous consent. You should get it.
Mr. Chairman, can I object so we just have a, I'll object temporarily just till we understand what we're doing, because amendment to the amendment, I'm not sure we all do.
Gentleman from Florida reserves the right to object.
Sure.
So
Just till we understand it, and
So
we get from council what we're doing.
do we have the
Mr. Chairman?
Do we have a copy of that?
gentleman from Illinois? Go ahead.
I'm accepting
Griffin.
Mr. Griffin's amendment,
And then he said there's
and I'm proposing that we make paragraph P neutral by adding certain phrases, and the resulting new paragraph P again will read any resulting change to the impact of increased or decreased air pollution in the air of the northern hemisphere by virtue of jobs leaving or coming to the U.S. to countries in the northern hemisphere that do not have substantially similar laws and regulations of the United States of America. And I think that fulfills his intentions, and I accept it if he accepts this amendment, which he said he do. And now I ask that we have by unanimous consent that we accept the Rush amendment as amended by Mr. Griffin.
Without objection, the amendment offered by Mr. Griffith is so modified. And without seeing members wishing to speak on the amendment, the vote is on the amendment to the amendment. The vote is on the Griffith amendment to the amendment offered by Mr. Rush. Those in favor of the amendment by Mr. Griffith will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment to the Rush amendment is accepted. The vote now occurs on the Rush amendment as amended by the Griffith amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman asked for a roll call vote. The clerk will call the tally.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus. No. Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Pitts, no. Mr. Pitts, no. Ms. Bono-Mack. Ms. Bono-Mack, no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, no. Mr. Rogers. No. Mr. Rogers, no. Ms. Myrick. Ms. Myrick, no. Mr. Sullivan. No. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Ms. Blackburn. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray, aye. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, no. Ms. McMorris-Rogers. Ms. McMorris-Rogers, no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Zukowski. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton, no.
Members wishing to change their votes or wishing to cast a vote, Mr. Dingle.
Mr. Dingle, off no, on aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 20 ayes and 28 noes.
20 ayes, 28 noes. The amendment as amended is not agreed to. Are there other members wishing to offer an amendment? Gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps.
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. It's 001.
001. The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2401 offered by Ms. Capps.
And the amendment will be considered as read. Staff will distribute the amendments, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take 5 minutes because this is a very common sense amendment, and it requires the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to ensure that the 104 nuclear reactors in this country can withstand a complete loss of electricity caused by severe natural disasters. We cannot afford to ignore the series of wake-up calls that we've received in this country during the past several months. Worldwide, in Japan, a devastating tsunami knocked out power to the Fukushima nuclear plants. The cores of 3 reactors partially melted down. Spent nuclear fuel was on fire, spewing radioactive material into the air. Highly radioactive water found its way into the Pacific Ocean. Radiation contaminated the tap water, milk, and the food supply. The result was the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. In Nebraska, a huge flood nearly overwhelmed the Fort Calhoun nuclear plant's barriers and threatened to cut off power to the site. In New Mexico, a massive wildfire threatened the Los Alamos laboratory, where thousands of drums of low-level radioactive waste are currently stored. Currently, NRC regulations do not require nuclear plants to be able to cope with a combination of fires, flooding, and an earthquake. But that is exactly what happened in Japan. Right now, NRC standards don't require nuclear power plants to be prepared to handle a prolonged loss of electrical power, but that's what we saw in Japan. An extended loss of power could also result from a forest fire or a flooding river or any combination of natural disasters. In 2003, the NRC found that 93 U.S. reactors had an ability to cope with a loss of power for 4 hours, while 11 reactors could cope for 8 hours. In my opinion, that is simply not long enough. If these reactors lost power for a couple of days, we'd have a nuclear disaster on our hands. Without power, the systems that keep the reactor core and the spent fuel cool cannot operate for very long. And if cooling stops, it is only a matter of time before a reactor's core begins to melt down or spent nuclear fuel starts to burn. Our nation's nuclear plants must be able to avoid a meltdown in this situation. So I encourage my colleagues to support this straightforward nuclear safety amendment, and I'm prepared to yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Mr. Terry is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I raised the issue of whether this is germane to the EPA rule train wreck, but that is, pardon me?
It is germane. We've checked.
The second issue is the gentlelady from California raised the issue of the Fort Calhoun nuclear power plant, which supplies the power to my district. And I've been to Fort Calhoun nuclear power plant several times since the beginning of the core-caused flood. And I know Good Morning America tried to create an issue with that power plant that was false, but the reality is that it was never in danger. And floodwaters are on the property, but not affecting any of the operation. And just coincidentally, they were shut down for their routine maintenance anyway, and they're not starting it up, even though the NRC says they can right now. So I just don't want there to be a false impression out there that the Fort Calhoun nuclear power plant is in any danger at all because of the floodwaters. It's high and dry. Well, it's not high, and outside isn't. It's wet, but I've walked inside every one of the buildings, inspected the live feed of the nuclear reactor and the containment areas, and everything is dry and it's safe. So with you bringing it up, I felt I had to get some of that out. So and anybody else want time, I could yield my remaining 3 minutes. Seeing none, yield my time back.
Chairman yields back his time. The gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, obviously, we're all relieved that the plant that provides the service to Mr. Terry's district is safe, and we would hope that if we had a natural disaster at any of our nuclear plants in this country, that the first or second levels of protection, like those sandbags at his plant, would hold. But what we learned from the Fukushima Daiichi experience, and also what we learned in a different context from the Deepwater Horizon experience, is that catastrophic failures do happen. And you have to be prepared at several different levels for those catastrophic failures. And in the case of a nuclear reactor, a catastrophic failure, as we saw in Japan, can have serious health and economic effects, which is why it's so important that the NRC really look at all of the different options. We had a hearing, Mr. Chairman, in the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee where we discussed this. And there are some concerns with the NRC's modeling and simulation work. And we talked about this simulation they did of a severe loss of power scenario at the Peach Bottom plant in Pennsylvania. During that scenario, the plant came within 1 hour of core damage. Now, the simulation purported to determine the realistic consequences of a severe accident, and when it did, it almost resulted in a simulated partial meltdown. I guess the good news is that they came within an hour they were able to stop it within the hour of the core damage, but the bad news is it was only an hour. And even in this simulation, they didn't consider the impact of a disastrous event on spent fuel pools. So we know that in Japan, uncovered spent fuel was a major source of radiation and radioactive contamination. And so this really highlights a significant vulnerability in our own backup plans. And I was frankly really disturbed about this when we had the hearing. If there's a complete loss of electrical power, as Ms. Capps said, the backup plans only account for a 4 to 8 hour interruption of this electrical power backup. Now, if you really had some kind of a catastrophic disaster, God forbid, some kind of terrorist attack or something like that, 4 to 8 hours is simply not going to be enough. And so I think what Ms. Capps is trying to do with her amendment is to fill that gap, improve the safety of our nuclear plants, and I think we could all agree on that, whatever our opinion is on nuclear power. I think we could all agree that we should really look at the effects of a catastrophe, and we should think about really having electrical backup that would prevent us from what happened in Japan. And with that, I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other member, gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask the council a couple questions, if I could. Yes. I want, on the Capps amendment, first time we've actually seen this, but it says the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in conjunction with the Environmental Protection Agency, for the purpose of preventing the release of radioactive pollution. Does the Environmental Protection Agency have joint responsibility with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission under existing law relating to radioactive material from a nuclear power plant?
do not know the answer to that question.
Does the gentlelady from California know if EPA currently has regulatory authority over radioactive pollution?
We believe that they do, yes.
And do you believe that they do, but do we have definitive proof that they do?
They do have an Office of Radiation. I'm happy to supply that information.
Well, I mean, I would have difficulty voting for this amendment until we had a definitive answer on that, because...
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir, I'd be happy.
As I understand, the EPA sets what is a safe level of exposure to radiation. So they do have a part of the jurisdiction which primarily is with the NRC, but they do together.
But this talks about preventing the release of radioactive pollution. I know the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a lot of authority, I mean, I thought exclusive authority relating to prevention of releases, and I would be reluctant to give EPA additional authority in this area of nuclear waste prevention unless they already have that authority definitively. I'd be happy to yield, gentleman from Illinois.
And while you're having a pause, we're trying to draft a secondary amendment to address one of the provisions in this amendment, which is the spent fuel. And I wouldn't be willing to accept this amendment until we talked about spent fuel, since it's such a big issue at Fukushima Daiichi. And you know, the secondary amendment would talk about placing all spent nuclear fuel in a centralized location in Yucca Mountain. So I would encourage my colleagues to not support this amendment until we have an opportunity to offer a secondary amendment to address high-level nuclear waste, which we've already spent $14.5 billion to develop a centralized facility in a desert underneath a mountain, 90 miles from Las Vegas. It's the law of the land from the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and so we're trying to work on that secondary amendment right now. And I yield back to my colleague from Kentucky.
Gentleman, yield.
I'd be happy to yield.
I just want to point out that 3 reactors melted down in Japan, so the problem wasn't just the spent fuel. This was a problem with the reactors themselves, and what the CAPS amendment is suggesting is that that we have an evaluation of the from each nuclear power facility of what they're doing to prevent damage to reactor cores in the event of loss of an on-site electric power for any extended period of time. I think it's a reasonable idea. It's not beyond the range of comprehension that such a thing can happen. We saw this happen in Japan, where we had the combination of a tsunami and an earthquake. In New Mexico, we had fires in Los Alamos. The Diablo Canyon is near an earthquake site. We need to look at the most severe, most severe situation where there can be a loss of power. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission at the present time uses an analysis where power is out for a short period of time, but plants are not required to be able to cope with a prolonged loss of electrical power, and this amendment would fill that gap and improve the safety of our nuclear plants. I think it's a good amendment. I urge our colleagues to support it.
Will the gentleman yield?
Well, my time has expired.
Gentleman, his time has expired. Other members, gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm going to be really brief. I don't know if there is anyone here today that has any objection to the goals of the amendment. It seems appropriate. The only question I have, and I'm going to join Mr. Whitfield, are we bringing the EPA in an area that is not really relevant to their present jurisdiction? It would be my understanding that the NRC, it might be the appropriate agency when it comes to the construction, certification, approval of a facility, how it's operated, how it's maintained, how it's inspected. And to that degree, I'd be in full support of the amendment. I'm just not real sure where the relevancy of the EPA comes in. And I don't know. I don't think council was able to
Gentlemen,
answer that
yield.
question as posed by Mr. Whitfield. Does anyone?
Mr. Gonzalez, let's ask unanimous consent to strike the EPA. Let's just have the NRC do this job. Anybody, Mr. Chairman?
have no problem with that.
Then we strike EPA.
Yeah, I would. I have no objection to striking EPA.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman,
Can we?
would that make it still germane to this bill?
No, that's
not the right amendment. Do you have the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if we have a unanimous consent or a request on the floor, but if there's any further discussion, I would just ask anybody here that's present as to the EPA's present role in jurisdiction. And if it's appropriate, then I'd reconsider. Otherwise, I think what Mr. Waxman is proposing would be appropriate, and we can still get to the goal of the CAPS amendment, and I would yield back.
A motion has been made to strike in line 2 and 3 in conjunction with the Environmental Protection Agency. Is there objection to striking those words?
Point of order.
Gentleman from...
My question would be, if you strike the reference to the Environmental Protection Agency, does that leave this amendment germane to this bill?
We believe it would. We wouldn't want to strike it if it didn't. So we don't think that takes away the germaneness of the amendment itself.
Because are we working with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission here?
Just confer with counsel here 1 second. We're told that it's okay. And review of the council. So,
withdraw my point of order.
Without objection, from the comma after the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, comma, in conjunction with the Environmental Protection Agency, is struck. So, in essence, it will read the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for the purpose of preventing the release of radioactive pollution, and go on with line 5. Is there objection to the change of that amendment? Hearing none, that is now the amendment. And I would just like to, I'll strike the last word just to say I had a fairly lengthy conversation yesterday with the chairman of the NRC, who is preparing a report that should be available later today or certainly later in the week, in terms of their analysis of what happened at Fukushima. They will be making a number of recommendations. I want to give every member the assurance that this committee with jurisdiction over the NRC will entertain those recommendations and work with the NRC to make sure that the operation of all 104 sites is safe, and we can actually learn constructively from the difficulties that were made in Japan. And I would say that with this change that we can accept the amendment as written.
Mr. Would you
yield to the gentleman from...
Again, as we're working on a drafting of a secondary amendment, the ranking member is correct. There was core that melted, but he curiously left off the major radioactivity that was lost in the spent pools. The spent pools, the loss of power, or the crack in the pools, the water going down, was a major part of Fukushima Daiichi. And to not address, it's addressed in the amendment, for us not to focus on, again, going back to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, over 30 years of U.S. policy towards a centralized location in a mountain underneath the desert, 90 miles from Las Vegas, does not address the risk of, as you list here, nuclear poisoning or air emissions of radiation. The best way to do that is to centralize it underneath a mountain in a desert, in an arid location. 30 years We need to have that part of this amendment to go forward, and until we do that, I would encourage my colleagues to not support the amendment.
Will the gentleman yield?
It's not my time.
Gentleman will
Point of parliamentary procedure.
Gentleman will state his parliamentary.
As I understand it, if we adopt the CAPS amendment, a further amendment that the gentleman suggested would be in order. I don't think we need to sacrifice this amendment because you don't have that as well. Let's take the first issue, resolve it, and then if you have another amendment you want to offer, let's debate that amendment. But it would be in order.
Gentleman yield. It would be in order, but I would still vote against it.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have a problem with this amendment. First of all, I think that we all agree that Jackson would not have the expertise in this issue. Obviously, ambient nuclear exposure, even radon, EPA is talking about, and I'm glad to see that taken out. If you want to add somebody in with that can add an informed decision, I think Secretary Chu was who you want to step in. But the whole text of this amendment implies that the agency is not doing this as we speak. It implies as if the agency is not on top of this issue. And I think that's quite unfair to the agency. The fact is, every report we have seen coming out, if you take the time to get the informed decisions, it's showing the agency's been on top of these issues again and again and again, to the point where even the agency recognizes that the regulatory oversight of the domestic nuclear power industry has been so safety oriented that they even take second thought about how far they've required the industry to go.
Gentleman yield.
Now, let me hold up just a second. And the fact is that this spent fuel issue is enough of an issue that we need to address that our own Senator Feinstein, after looking at what happened in Japan, specifically has taken a position that we need to revisit the abandonment of Yucca Mountain. And the fact is, this is exactly what I was talking before about those who are concerned about safety issues and raise health risks. Got to stop saying no. Have to say yes to the best technology, best availability. And Senator Feinstein, to her credit, has said we need to go back and find reasons to say yes, to allow technology to do, allow good science to do, get the politics to take a second seat to good science. And frankly, I think the concern I have here is the regulatory agencies have concerns, have looked at it, and are going to be coming out with extensive reports. This motion by itself, in all fairness to the gentlelady from California, implies they're not seriously looking at this stuff. I will yield to the gentlelady from California.
I would just like to clarify, as my colleague knows, he and I both have nuclear facilities in our respective congressional districts. The amendment is specifically designed to speak to the limitations, in my opinion, of the NRC's regulation, in which they say that is very unlikely, almost impossible, that there would be a combination of the most severe natural phenomena, including earthquakes.
Reclaiming my time. Let me just say this. Anyone who takes a look at what happened in Japan and takes a look at our California facilities comes out feeling more confident of the safety of our facilities than there was before. And I'd just like to point out, we can go down the list of not having fuel tanks. We can go down the whole list of pump facilities being secured. The whole list down the line becomes more secure. The fact is, when you look at this, too many people are not recognizing that 20,000 people died in Japan. 20,000. Every one of my grandchildren and children live in a tsunami area, except for the ones in Helena, thank God, but they're under volcanoes. 20,000 died from the tsunami. Not one has been proven to die from the nuclear reactors. If you want to take the science of what those numbers say, it says that it's 20,000 times more dangerous for me to live next to the beach than next to a nuclear power plant.
Would my colleague yield?
I don't know. I'll yield to the gentlelady.
Because you are exactly right in underscoring the importance of this amendment. I had a conversation. We've heard the chairman of the NRC testify. In my conversations with him, they are limited in what their regulations now propose, and that's what this amendment goes after, which is that they do not consider the likelihood of a combination of natural
Reclaiming my time, I think if you look at your facility and my facility, to compare it to Japan is not only a misrepresentation, I think it is using misinformation to misinform and scare the public. The fact is, your facility and my facility could have survived what happened in Japan in an area that it is geologically impossible for the incident to occur. How much more assurance does our constituency need? At the same time, that you and I cannot assure anybody living within a mile of the ocean that the same tsunami couldn't have happened there. We are not saying that we're going to have to move populations or that we should be studying moving populations. There's a reasonable issue. I'm just saying this motion implies something that I think all of us know scientifically is not true, and regulatory-wise, I still don't believe it's true. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Vote. Vote. Let's
Mr.
vote.
Chairman?
Who seeks? Gentleman from Texas, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to identify myself, first of all, with the comments from my colleague from Illinois. I mean, it is critically important to our national security that we have a single repository for our nuclear waste. I was on the Homeland Security Committee last Congress, and one of the issues we discussed over and over was the fact that we've got nuclear waste sitting in over 50 locations all across this country. And from a Homeland Security perspective, and somebody who might want to have some terrorists, who might want to have a dirty bomb, it's much more dangerous to have it scattered all over the country than having it in one particular place, one location, right there in Nevada. The other concern I have, and I just want to straighten out a misconception about this being a problem with the reactor being a problem at Los Alamos. That wasn't the case. The fire there wasn't a threat to the reactor. It was a threat to the spent fuel. And so we've got to address this problem. We need to get it out of places like Los Alamos and put it in Yucca Mountain. And if we have an opportunity to do that on this bill, I support that. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? If not, the vote occurs on the CAPS amendment as modified by the unanimous consent request. Those in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, no. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack, no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray, no. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers, no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshu. Ms. Eshu, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Upton.
Votes no.
Mr. Upton, no.
Are there other members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Inslee.
Mr. Inslee, aye.
Ms. Myrick.
Mrs. Myrick, no.
Are there other members? Mr. Dingle.
Mr. Dingle, aye.
Are there other members wishing to cast votes? Seen none, the clerk will report the tally. Mr. Pallone, is he recorded?
Mr. Plone, aye. Mr. Chairman, on that there were 18 ayes, 30 nays.
18 ayes, 30 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman from Texas.
I don't have an amendment, but I'd like to strike the record.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have spent the last hour, as we listened to the debate, actually reading the final transport rule here. It's 1,300 pages long, and I want to bring the committee's attention to page 443 through pages 449 of this rule, where it talks about benefits. And I just want members to have an open mind and just listen. And I especially want Drs. Cassidy and Burgess and Murphy and Gingrey, who are medical doctors, to listen. And Mrs. Capps, who I believe is a registered professional nurse. And if there are others that have got medical training. First of all, it says that, Dr. Christians, it says that 1 in 20 deaths in the United States every year is caused by exposure to unhealthy levels of ozone and PM 2.5. 1 in 20. Now, that seems a little high to me, but maybe it is. Okay? Then it goes on to say that if we implement these rules, we're going to save a minimum of 13,000 somewhere between 13,000 and 34,000 premature deaths per year, and that's the statistic that Ranking Member Waxman has referred to. It monetizes those benefits, and the minimum monetized benefit on page 449 for those 13,000 saved deaths is $100 billion. $100 billion. Now that's the minimum. If you divide 13,000 into 100 billion, you get approximately $8 million per saved premature death. Now, where they get that, I don't know, the $100 billion. But $8 million per death, if that's some sort of an economic benefit, that the person who has to be at least age 30 under their assumption, then that means that their annual income for the next 35 years is at least $230,000 a year, if that's the assumption. I'm not saying that that is. But what I would ask the committee on both sides of the aisle they cite two studies, one done in 2002 and one done in 2006. And they use these numbers, I'm quoting their numbers, and they admit, and they say in their benefit analysis, that 90 to 95% of the benefit is by preventing these premature deaths.
Gentleman yield.
I'll be happy to.
What value would you put on a human life? You think $8 million is too much?
I don't know, but I don't make $230,000 a year. You don't make $230,000 a year.
So tell us what value you would put
I
on
don't
it.
know. My point is,
you think
this is the minimum.
How did they determine the value?
I don't know.
Well, it would have been nice if we had a hearing, wouldn't it? Then you
know,
can ask these questions.
Well, I have
Instead, it's
asked.
all being dropped on the
reclaiming
trainer.
my time, Chairman Waxman.
Yeah, it's your
I have repeatedly asked the EPA to justify. This is not an EPA study. These are two studies, one by the American Cancer Society and another independent study, one that's 2002, one that's 2006, and they get these huge benefits. And all I'm pointing out to the committee is, wouldn't it be nice to have some independent agency actually validate this before we assume at face value that the benefits are as they say they are?
Gentlemen, yield further.
I'd be happy to yield.
Well, it sounds to me like you're making a distinction that there's a mechanic making $40,000 to $50,000 a year. That shouldn't be $8 million. But if it's a wealthier man, then maybe $8 million would be adequate.
I'm not making any assumptions at all.
Well, you're assuming that their assumptions aren't correct.
No, I'm not even assuming. I'm assuming that we ought to at least independently investigate them.
Okay, how would you suggest we do that?
Well, first, I think we ought to get the EPA to actually do a real analysis themselves. Then maybe we could have a hearing. Maybe we could bring in some statisticians and some mortality experts and actually see.
The gentleman yield on that.
Dr. Murphy.
Mr. Chairman, isn't that what having this panel appointed look at all those numbers is all about? And this is about doing an extensive study and asking administration to do that. That's why we're doing this bill, so we can get that very accurate information.
My time's expired, but my point, Mr. Chairman, is we just take all these assumptions at face value, and by their own admission, the EPA is saying that 90% of the benefit is by the prevention of these premature deaths, and I think any open-minded person would be correct to at least question some of these assumptions.
Mr. Chairman?
And I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
I wish to be recognized to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
There are difficulties whenever you want to quantify something. If you want to quantify the cost, you could take the amount that the industry says they'd have to spend on a particular regulation, which may or may not be accurate, but that's at least something that's monetized. But when you're talking about asthma's prevented, or heart attacks, or lives, or children not being able to learn, then it's hard to put a number on it. But we can't say because it's hard, that can't be done. EPA does analysis, or they contract for analysis. The whole purpose of this bill is you don't trust this government agency to do its job. So you're going to set up another government agency to watch over the existing government agencies. You're going to create another bureaucracy to be sure that the numbers are right. And until those numbers are determined to be accurate, we will assume that the numbers by EPA, which has a legal responsibility to do this, can't be trusted. Now, that's the road we're taking with this TRAIN Act legislation. That's the purpose of the TRAIN Act. But on top of the TRAIN Act, we've had the amendment that would stop the EPA rules. They've been working on those rules for a decade. And they've done all sorts of analysis. And they've come up with rules dealing with mercury emissions and transport of air pollution from one state to another. If you have air pollution from another state, you can do nothing about it, and you're trying to come into compliance with the health standards for the air, you have to figure out how to do it even though you have no control over the air pollution coming in, which means you've got to press harder on your sources of pollution to reduce it even more. So a lot of states would like to do something about the air pollution that's brought into the state by some other sources in another state. But we're going to stop those rules. We're going to stop EPA from going forward with those rules on the assumption that Mr. Barton doesn't think they've done a correct analysis. If that's your assumption, then we ought to hold hearings on the details of how these determinations are made by EPA. And we haven't done that. We ought to know it if you feel that you want to go into that level of detail. As I understood the way the law has worked is we ask EPA to set a health standard. And they bring in the experts to talk about a health standard under the Clean Air Act. And then the states are supposed to come up with an implementation plan to reach those health standards. But we're saying, no, that doesn't count anymore. We need some other analysis. In fact, we need another government agency to do another analysis. This is the road we're taking with this legislation. It is fundamentally flawed. The purpose of the Crane Act is to stop regulation, not to make sure that it really is accurate. And the purpose of the EPA writers in this bill is to stop the EPA from doing what they've been working on. When does it end? Is no regulation worthwhile? Some of you would say that. I've heard it said over and over again. EPA regulations or any government regulations kill jobs. Well, if you don't have those regulations, there are people that are going to die. And you could put a monetary value on them, or you could say they don't count. But I don't think we ought to have a discussion of $8 million being excessive because some people don't make a lot of money. I don't know what the value of a life is, but if we're going to talk about the value of life, the value of avoiding pain, the value of preventing illnesses, we ask the agencies to come up with a risk-benefit analysis, and they come up with some number, and we could go into more detail on how that number is achieved. But I think this whole bill is ridiculous, and this whole discussion is outrageous. If you want to go into the fundamental questions, hold a hearing, not just do a markup, not come up with legislation that says we won't trust regulatory agencies. We want another bureaucracy to ride herd over them, which really is the purpose for the purpose of making sure they do nothing. And if you want nothing done, go back to the core bills themselves. Repeal the Clean Air Act. Repeal all these other laws, and then let's see what the impact will be. And we know what it will be. A lot of people will be
Well, the gentleman yield?
harmed. Yes.
Do you think that all of the things that we've done in the last 20 years on this committee have it had any positive impact on public health?
Absolutely.
I agree.
Absolutely.
But the premise of this interpretation is that it hasn't.
Of what interpretation?
Of the analysis I just referred to.
No, they're talking about a mercury rule and a transport rule, and you're looking at the justifications for those rules.
What I just cited, Mr. Waxman, only refers to PM 2.5 in ozone. That's all.
And so, therefore, what conclusion do you reach?
Well, the conclusion I reach is that their analysis at least needs to be reviewed by experts, and it wouldn't hurt if the EPA would actually use some of their internal experts to do a little analysis themselves.
That's not what's pending before us. What's pending before us is a bill to put another layer of bureaucracy on all the other bureaucracies that are in existence and do the study further and let nothing happen until that study's done. That's what's before us, and in a minute we'll get to the vote, and I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to vote no on that bill. I want to see all of you vote yes for a new bureaucracy, new government spending, and stopping regulation. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The question now occurs on favorably reporting the bill as amended to the House. So all those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no.
No.
Ayes appear. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mrs. Bonomack. Mrs. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, nay. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, nay. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, nay. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, nay. Ms. Eshu. Ms. Eshu, nay. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, nay. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, nay. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, nay. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, nay. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, nay. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, nay. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Mrs. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, nay. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Dr. Burgess.
Dr. Burgess, aye.
Ms. Myrick.
Mrs. Myrick, aye.
Ms. Myrick asked for
Mrs. Myrick, aye.
Mr. Bilbray.
Mr. Bilbray, aye.
Mr. Pitts.
Mr. Pitts, aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. Mr. Stearns?
Mr. Stearns, aye.
Same. No. Green, Gonzo, Ross, Madison. Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that, there are 33 ayes, 13 nays.
33 ayes, 13 nays. The bill is approved as amended. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bills approved by the committee. We now call up the bill H.R. 2273, and the clerk will report the title.
Mr. Chairman, on the last bill, would you allow for language for the review period?
Minority views, without objection, the minority views will be given the proper amount of time. Chair calls up H.R. 2273. The clerk will report the title.
H.R. 2273, to amend Subtitle D of the Solid Waste Disposal Act to facilitate recovery and beneficial use and provide for the proper management and disposal of materials generated by the combustion of coal and other fossil fuels.
And without objection, the bill is considered as read, and to recognize Mr. Shimkus for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report that amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2273 offered by Mr. Shimkus of Illinois.
And without objection, the reading of that substitute is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment, and the staff will distribute that substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to start by saying I appreciate my friends on both sides of the aisle for trying to get as close as we could. I'm not sure where we're at the end of the day, but we have been working diligently over many weeks to try to get to a better bill. Having said that, for me, and the clock has struck 12 and we need to move forward, this amendment is predicated on a few simple concepts. It creates a program under Subtitle D for state regulation of coal ash and addresses the management of disposal of coal combustion residuals in landfills, surface impoundments, and other land-based units. If a state is currently approved to implement either a municipal solid waste permit program or is authorized to implement a hazardous waste permit program and thus has previously demonstrated to EPA its ability to run these types of permitting programs, the state is pre-approved to operate a coal combustion residuals permit program. All states have approved programs for municipal solid waste under the Solid Waste Disposal Act, and those programs are governed by existing regulations promulgated by EPA pursuant to Section 4010 of the Solid Waste Disposal Act. These regulations, the revised criteria, are a known quantity to the states and are based on the requirement that they be protective of human health and the environment. These existing known and environmentally protective requirements are more than adequate to serve as a baseline for regulation of coal ash, so no new federal regulations are needed to deal with the coal ash. Using these criteria, the bill sets out minimum standards for a coal ash permit program. States can choose to be more protective than the federal baseline. To implement a permit program, states must notify EPA of their intent to adopt and implement a permit program and must certify that they will implement a permit program that meets the minimum federal baseline. If a state chooses not to adopt and implement a coal combustion residual permit program, EPA would step in and implement a program based on the same federal baseline. A state can always take back a permit program from EPA by notifying EPA of its intent to assume or resume control of the permit program and certifying to EPA that its permit program meets the minimum specification. This amendment improves the bill marked up in subcommittee in several important ways. As part of their certification, states are required to submit detailed information laying out why their coal combustion residuals permit program complies with the minimum federal requirements, including a legal certification that the state has fully effective statutes, regulations, and guidance that meet the minimum specifications for coal ash permit program. If a coal combustion residuals management or disposal structure is determined by the permitting authority to be high hazard potential under FEMA's guidelines for dam safety, the permitting authority has the authority under this bill to assess the structural stability of the structure and require corrective action if necessary. And if correction action isn't undertaken, the permitting authority has the authority to require closure pursuant to the requirements of the bill. The bill sets out particular criteria as part of the federal baseline for coal ash permit program and specifically includes criteria for groundwater monitoring, location restrictions, design requirements, and structural integrity. Should a permit program transfer from EPA back to a state or vice versa, the amendment clarifies what happens during the transition from one permitting authority to another and makes it clear that permits and corrective actions remain unchanged until the new permitting authority takes the action to change them. This amendment creates a unique program that gives states the right to regulate coal ash using existing, familiar, and environmentally protective federal municipal solid waste requirements by allowing states to adopt and implement a coal combustion residuals permit program in the same fashion as they operate their existing municipal solid waste programs. EPA stated explicitly in its proposed rule in June 2010 that these requirements were a reasonable balance between ensuring protection of human health and the environment from the risk of coal ash and the practical realities of facilities' ability to implement the criteria, and that the, in quotations, engineered structures regulated under Part 258 are very similar to those found at coal combustion residual disposal facilities and the regulations applicable to such units would be expected to address the risk presented by the constituents in coal combustion residual waste. Moreover, coal combustion residual waste do not contain the constituents that are likely to require modification of the existing Part 258 requirements, such as organics, for example. No adjustments would be needed to ensure that groundwater monitoring would be protective, as CCR components are all readily distinguishable by standard analytical chemistry. By generally adopting the framework of the Municipal Solid Waste Program in Part 258 and by setting out specific criteria and requirements for a coal combustion residuals permit program, the amendment obviates the need to recreate the wheel and have EPA issue new federal regulations for coal ash. The amendment for the first time sets a federal baseline for all coal combustion residuals permit programs, but allows states to be stringent if they wish, which allows states to tailor their programs as necessary. In doing so, the amendment ensures the integrity and safety of the coal ash materials used in beneficial reuse products. The amendment also ensures the structural integrity of structures that handle coal ash. As a municipal solid waste, each state that intends to adopt and implement a permit program must certify that their state's program meets the minimum requirements. EPA's role is to, and cross-check the state's permit program as set out in the certificate against the minimum requirements of the amendment. Mr. Chairman, I'm almost done. This amendment is a common-sense approach that promotes states' rights, conserves resources by obviating the need for duplicative and time-consuming federal regulation, protects the environment, preserves jobs lost as a result of unduly burdensome federal regime suggested by EPA in June 2010, and I urge its support.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. This is a bill, and I want to thank the chair of our Environment and Economy Subcommittee for working with us. We had a legislative hearing months ago and said this is something we could work on. We could solve this problem. And the manager's amendment goes a long way that we've worked on. I think there's still some other issues that we're concerned about, and I'll just bring them up. Our whole point on this was what happened in Tennessee with wet impoundment. And there's still some concern about when you have a wet impoundment, that the groundwater monitoring, the concern about the leaching into the groundwater. I have a little bit of concern about the dust issue. I'm familiar with how we control dust under state law, I'm told now, from our piles of residual from refineries. And I think that that's a concern I have, that how you would deal with the particulate matter that gets blown. We've done a long way, gone a long way since when we started the first draft of the bill, and I want to compliment my colleague from Illinois for doing that. We're still not quite there, though, and believe me, I'd like to show this as a real bipartisan bill, and with maybe a little more time, we could do this, get our staffs. And I don't know if my colleague from Pennsylvania wants to talk about it, because I know Congressman Doyle's been involved in it, particularly because of the number of wet impoundments in his area. And if you'd like, I can yield you some of the time, Mike.
Yeah, I want to thank the gentleman from Texas. I too want to say I was hopeful this was something that we could get together and be supportive of. There's lots about this bill that I think is okay, but I don't think anyone really believes that we should be treating wet impoundments for coal ash the same as we treat our household garbage. And it's this section of the bill that really gives me some pause and keeps me from being able to be yes right now. And I was hoping we could sit down and resolve some of these. I mean, the way it's structured now, this only requires states to apply undefined, generally accepted engineering standards to these structures. I think we need a different criteria here. It just doesn't appear to me that this provides enough corrective action of wet impoundments, especially those that are considered not to be high hazard. It's my hope that our staffs can continue to work on this issue and resolve what I think is a very serious problem. We have hopefully we can make the time to get this done and come to some resolution. But based on our inability to be able to do it at this time, I'm not able to support this either at this present time.
Would the gentleman yield to me?
I'll be glad to yield. I need about 30 seconds at the end, John, but I'll be glad to yield to my colleague from Michigan.
Don't be told. Go ahead. Oh, well, I just simply want to observe, if you're trying to kill the bill, to cease the negotiations at this time is a fine way to begin. My two colleagues and I are happy to work with our colleagues on the other side to try and come up with a bipartisan bill. If that is not the desire of the majority, then so be it. The problems are not large, they're difficult, but they can be addressed. And I would urge my colleagues on the other side to continue the staff discussions. I'm willing to vote for a bipartisan bill, but I certainly am not going to, as my good friend from Pennsylvania said, treat coal ash the same way I do household trash. There's a big difference, and people are going to be seriously hurt because of it. So I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Thank you, and I want to thank both Chairman Emeritus Dingell and his staff and Congressman Doyle for trying to get where we're at. We've been working for months. My concern about, in closing on the amendment that was laid out, the manager's amendment, there were some agreements made that over the last day or so, and I'm pointing out on line 6 where in double I and in B, where in B single I, where it says as appropriate. I thought we had a number of things we had agreed on, and we were down to only dealing with the disposal of wet impoundment or dry. But I see this manager's amendment doesn't even do some of the things that we had agreed to. So, Mr. Chairman, it's real difficult to support a manager's amendment that not where we were at when I thought, at the end of the day yesterday. And I'm out of time, I see.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California seeks time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just like to ask, as we step back, to take a look at this issue from both sides of the aisle. And we could really help the process, the outcome of the process, to be so much better if we care about the outcome. So often, though, the procedure takes precedence over outcome, and then we wonder why people lose trust in the ability for government to address these issues. And I want to give you just an example of what the frustration I had as a regulatory, in a regulatory agency. We had actually worked years at trying to find a way to utilize sandblasting sand and avoid it having to be put in our landfills and being, dropped in our creeks or whatever. So we actually developed a system where you had people going around picking up the sandblasting sand and using it as an aggregate for asphalt and cement. And that reuse was not only avoiding the disposal problem, but also was avoiding having to go into rural areas and find virgin material for aggregate and then ship it into the urban areas with all the pollution and all the environmental impact. The whole system worked great until somebody at the California level at the Cal EPA decided that, wait a minute, because there was trace elements of metal, lead, zinc, whatever in this sand after it had been used for sandblasting, that it now had to be tracked and reported as a hazardous material. The paperwork and the regulatory oversight of that one rulemaking drove the recycling industry out of business. So good intention of somebody thinking there's helping the environment ended up creating a situation that destroyed a reasonable economic and environmental strategy because regulation took precedence over outcome. And so as we address these issues, and someone could say, oh, wait a minute, you don't want to have this stuff in your neighborhood. Well, I'm sorry, but if you take a look at asphalt, the asphalt that's in the street outside your house, if you grind it, if you pick it up, it becomes a hazardous material, hazardous waste as soon as you pick it up. Now, your kids are playing on it, you're driving on it, everybody's living around it. But as soon as you try to reuse it, Now you have a burden of proof far beyond what it took when you put when it was sitting in front of your yard the whole time. It's that type of regulatory insensitivity to outcome that has frustrated so many of us that have tried to say there's a good economic and environmental option if we just willing to put the regulatory straitjackets in the back corner and allow people to do what's practical and reasonable. So I'm not going to go at length on this except the fact that please, let's make sure we don't go out of this thinking we're saving the planet and we're not only trashing the economic opportunity, we're actually trashing the environmental cleanup at the same time. And
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield.
Thank you. Just in response, I do appreciate my colleagues and the weeks we've been working on it. And to my good friend, Mr. Dingle, we've been in the room. So I'm a little taken aback about the strong statement about walking away, because most of my opening statement on the manager's amendment was addressing what we've been talking about. Now, I want to read from the Federal Register to address Mr. Dingo, your and Mr. Doyle's particular point. The Federal Register, June 21st, 2010, here's the EPA. The EPA believes, and this was part of my opening statement, the EPA believes that Part 258 criteria represents a reasonable balance between ensuring the protection of human health and the environment from the risk of these wastes. Now, that's the EPA. That's what's on page 13 of our bill. That's what we're doing. This is not me. This is the EPA. Not only that, then why do we have this bill? Based upon the comments of what Mr. Bilbray was saying about sand, is there is 40% of coal combustion residuals is recycled, which keeps them out of landfill. But if we move in the direction of what the EPA wants to label it toxic, then we have to add 40% additional in toxic waste landfills, which the EPA even admits isn't toxic.
Would the gentleman yield for a second?
It's your
I'd point out, you need aggregate for cover every day. There's a meter of barrier sand that's got to be placed over the landfill when you do it. So you need to have that barrier sand in the mix by law under our regulations for landfill. So you're actually reusing it. It's not just throwing it away. It's actually using it as a product that's needed to fulfill the landfill laws. And yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. McKinley is recognized for 5 minutes.
Strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I've been listening to with whatever patience we have here to deal with the description of what fly ash is and its toxicity and its characteristics. It's been said that it's worse than what goes into a municipal landfill. That's just categorically false. There have been 2 studies done by the EPA on fly ash, 1993 and 2000. And both of them have said that it is not hazardous material. As a matter of fact, in the 2000 study, they even go so far as to say in the Federal Register, it's the result of their study, no documented cases of damage to human health or the environment has been identified from fly ash. Go on with that. We talked about whether it's wet impoundments or dry impoundments. We know that fly ash is used as an agricultural additive. In the 2000 study, they went on to say that the agricultural use of fly ash creates no adverse environmental impact, and the EPA identified no case damage cases associated with this practice. These have been studied. We look at the levels of toxicity. This is fly ash. These are the chemical trace elements of fly ash, and here are the toxicity levels. In every case, it falls below the level of toxicity. When we look at that and consider that, not the hyperbole that we hear from so many people talking about this as a poisonous, I've heard it said time and time again over the last 6 months that this is a toxic material. It's no more toxic than the earth in your front yard and what you just heard about in the asphalt in the roads. It's their part of our life. What we need to focus on here are jobs. 27 states in this country mine coal. 27 states. And here are all the power plants that generate electricity all across America. Every one of them is producing fly ash. The issue is, what are we going to do with it? Knowing that it's no more hazardous in the soil in our backyard. And we're trying to say that it's worse than in a municipal landfill that they store battery acid, motor fuels, freon gases, old tires, treated lumber that are filled with CCA, the most heavily arsenic level you could. I trust our states. Our states are managing fly ash today, and they'll manage fly ash tomorrow because they've done a good job. It may have some failures on sometimes with municipal solid waste. But we have now strengthened, thanks to this amendment that was bipartisanly supported, it's going to require far more stringent than current municipal landfills. So we're in the right direction. I want people to understand this is what we're talking about. And again, for those people that don't understand a jobs bill, that's what this is. This is a jobs bill, and it takes care of all this fly ash that's created all across America. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman from Michigan, recognized for 5 minutes.
With all respect for my colleagues on the other side, I don't know anybody in this room who is saying that these coal residues, or whatever they might be, should be regulated as hazardous wastes. The question is, how are they going to be regulated? And the particular concern that a lot of us have over here is, what happens when the retention ponds break? Or what happens when this stuff does get loose? Now, it just may be that some of my colleagues on the other side think that's just fine to go be dumped in somebody else's backyard. I don't. I sure as hell don't want it in my backyard. What we're trying to do is to see to it that we establish a mechanism for controlling this stuff so it doesn't get back into the environment. I happen to know that this stuff is useful. It can be made into wallboard and lots of other useful things, and I want to see that happen. But I do want to see that when somebody sets up a pond to control this stuff and it breaks, that all of a sudden somebody's not going to say, my God, Dingo, why were you sitting around down there letting this be set up so it could be in my backyard? All I think we ought to do is to see to it that we address the question of how we see to it that there's no leaching into the groundwater, that there's no escape of this stuff into the environment, that if a retention dam breaks, all of a sudden some community's not going to find that their whole community is awash in these kinds of semi-liquefied nastiness that's going to get into their yard. we're willing to talk about that with my Republican colleagues. I think it'd be a good thing to do. We offer you the hand of friendship, a chance to work together with us, and to have a bipartisan bill. I keep hearing about bipartisan bills, but I ain't seeing much evidence that that is desired. So if you want to work with us, we're willing to. If you don't, we will oppose the bill. You will probably prevail and get the bill through the House. But you will not get the bill through the Senate. And I'd be willing to bet you anybody in this room, a new hat, that you're going to get a veto by the President. My friends in the electrical utility industry would very much like to have this issue solved. So would I. I think it's important that we do so. But the course upon which we are set is not going to lead us in that direction. So my advice to my colleagues is, let's work together. You don't want to work together? We'll fight. That's not functioning as the Congress should, and it's not functioning as we should to protect the interests of our people, including our electrical utilities and all of the electrical consumers and the businesses that are dependent on it.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll be glad to yield, yeah.
Are you claiming that we have not worked for the past month on this bill? Are you making a statement that
I'm not.
My entire 5-minute opening statement was on positions?
If the gentleman would permit, I'm not claiming anything. I'm just simply saying, if you terminate the discussions now without understanding the points that I'm raising, that my two colleagues here are raising,
I just take offense.
You are not proceeding in accord with the good faith that we had hoped and had.
And are you assuming we don't have good faith in the negotiations? Are you making a claim that we didn't have good faith in the negotiations?
I'm not going to get in a great discussion with my good friend. Simple fact of the matter is, you could get a bill, or you can kill a bill. And there's all kinds of ways these things can be done. I hope that we can get a bill because the utility industry needs this. Quite frankly, the country needs it. But it takes two to tango, and I'm inviting the gentleman to tango with us. If he doesn't want to tango, then so be it. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are there other members wishing to speak in opposition or support of the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Kentucky.
I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Illinois.
And just to the Chairman Emeritus, on page 4, B and C, was language that we put in specifically on your staff's request on impoundment facilities.
Observe that this is fine as far as it goes. Negotiation requires that the gentleman from Illinois be satisfied and that my friends and I over here be satisfied. Until all the participants in the discussion are satisfied, we don't have a deal. And until we got a deal, we don't got a bill.
Reclaiming my time, and just to keep this whole thing in perspective, why are we here? We're here to make sure that that obviously coal combustion residuals doesn't get claimed by the EPA and under subtitle C, so that we continue the recycling industry and we can continue to store. Now we're talking about huge job impacts. Not just this is a whole part of this whole job debate. According to the Veritas study, that estimated under the subtitle D, you've got 39,000 to 64,000 jobs potentially lost if we allow this to go, or under other numbers are 183,000 to 316,000 jobs. Now, that's why we're doing this. That's why we've done in good faith to work across the aisle. We've made many changes, and I'll take the Chairman Emeritus' word. We'll just continue to move, cast our votes, be accountable to our constituents, whoever they may be, based upon how we cast our vote on this particular legislation. And with that, I yield back my time.
Yielded back. Asked unanimous consent. The gentleman is from Texas is yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we need a little more time. I guess my concern about the manager's amendment is that we had reached a point yesterday evening, and a lot of that's not reflected in here, and I don't have a list of any other amendments that are available. I was hoping to have a manager amendment. From what I understand, our last issue that we were literally working on up and all through this morning was the impoundment issue and how we could deal with that with adequate monitoring for groundwater. And the goal of this bill is to actually deal with what happened in Tennessee and yet continue to be able to, and I'll use Wisconsin example, to be able to use how much coal ash they use for recycling. They're 96, 97%, and their success, we don't want to eliminate that. But we also want to make sure that there's nothing happens like what happened in Tennessee. And so I thought we had gotten over the last 3 months since we had our legislative hearing to a point where, and that's why my concern is the manager amendment not reflected in the latest agreement or the last things we had last evening. And it would be much better if we had some time to put it all together and come back to the committee with the manager's amendment. But again, I'm following the dean of the House that, I can vote no, but I really want to be a problem solver, and I think that's what we were working on.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be glad to yield to my colleague.
Yeah, I just want to be clear to my colleagues from West Virginia, from Illinois. We're not suggesting regulating this under subsection C. We understand beneficial reuse. We don't have an argument here. We're trying to just get down to these last couple. I mean, the Tennessee thing was a wet impoundment. This is a real problem. We have them up in our neck of the woods too, and we're just trying to work out some final details in the language that I think would allow this to move forward as a bipartisan bill, and give you a chance to actually pass the bill. So it's a little bit frustrating that there seems to be a clock running here, and we've just got to do this right now when I think there's an opportunity to work it out. So,
gentlemen yield. Gentlemen yield. I just announced that.
I'll be glad to yield to the chair of the committee.
Votes have been called. We have about 15 votes on the House floor. So I think we'll adjourn until 3 o'clock, and we'll see if we can't negotiate a last-ditch compromise when we come back. We'll come back at 3. So we'll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Come back at 3 o'clock.